Hi, I'm Dan, and welcome to the Sleep Guidance channel, where history comes alive, even when it's freezing. Here's something you probably didn't know. During the brutal winter of 1894 to 1895, Britain recorded 70 consecutive days of frost, a streak so extreme it filled entire issues of Simons's meteorological magazine with alarmed commentary. Now, before we step into the winters that shaped Europe, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below when and where you're listening from, and I hope you enjoy today's video. If you lived in 1800s Europe, winter wasn't a backdrop for sentimental snow paintings or cosy evenings by a crackling hearth. It was a yearly showdown, one in which the weather arrived with the energy of a tax collector, demanding payments you absolutely did not have. Think of it this way: summer was a chance to live, autumn was a chance to prepare, and winter was a chance to not die. That was the bar. Comfort was never part of the calculation. The average family hoped simply to reach spring without losing too much weight, too much health, or too many relatives. The brutal truth is that winter rarely killed outright. It preferred subtlety. It attacked through a chain reaction. Cold air lowered resistance, which allowed respiratory illnesses to settle in, which made the body too weak to work, which meant no income, which meant no food, which weakened the body further, which, well, winter enjoyed its dominoes. Pneumonia, tuberculosis flare-ups, bronchitis and fevers didn't politely wait for warmer months. They thrived when the air bit your lungs before breakfast. And speaking of breakfast, winter meals were less about nourishment and more about negotiation. Food supplies that looked adequate in October suddenly shrank by December. Crops were long gone, markets were unpredictable, and transport slowed or stopped entirely. Winter wasn't impressed by your pantry. It was impressed by your ability to stretch ingredients without them staging a rebellion. If a winter stew tasted bland, that wasn't a mistake. It was a survival strategy. But the physical discomfort was only half the story. Winter also triggered an economic shutdown in many regions. Seasonal jobs vanished under snow. Agricultural labour collapsed between November and March. Bricklayers, roofers, carters, builders, road workers, and countless small trades found themselves unemployed the moment frost arrived. In cities, icy streets meant fewer customers and fewer working hours. In rural communities, frozen fields meant no planting, no repairing, and no wages. Winter didn't discriminate. It reduced almost everyone's income, except those fortunate enough to run businesses that thrived on suffering, such as firewood sellers, chimney sweeps, and doctors who made house calls with the energy of someone who absolutely knew they were about to have a profitable season. This collapse in work created a second wave of hardship. Poverty sharpened. Without income, families relied on whatever savings they had managed to squirrel away, savings that evaporated faster than breath on a window pane. Some pawned tools, clothing, or cherished objects. Some turned to neighbours for loans. Others turned to charity or poor relief systems, swallowing pride the way others swallowed thin broth. Winter intensified the class divide not through luxury, but through survival odds. The wealthy had high-quality coal and thick walls. The poor had prayers and layers of clothing that worked mostly out of spite. What made winter especially cruel was that many families did everything right and still struggled. They stored food, they rationed fuel, they planned ahead. But winter had no interest in fairness. A single illness in the household could wipe out weeks of savings. A broken cartwheel or a sick animal could disrupt transport or income. An unexpected cold snap could drain firewood supplies faster than planned. Winter's motto might as well have been, "Try again next year if you make it to next year." Despite the hardship, people adapted. They developed strategies, rituals and routines that would seem alien today. Daily life slowed down not because people wanted rest, but because exertion in severe cold was risky and costly. Many households restructured themselves around efficiency. Meals prepared in ways that saved heat, chores scheduled to minimize outdoor exposure, sleeping patterns adjusted to conserve energy. Winter wasn't merely a change of temperature. It was a change of behaviour, a reprogramming of the human schedule. Communities also tightened during these months, not out of sentimentality, but necessity. Borrowing, trading, and sharing resources became essential. Neighbours checked on each other not just for kindness, but because a household collapse could affect everyone. A sick farmer meant a failing supply chain. An impoverished family meant increased strain on parish funds. A freezing child meant another mouth at the charity door. Winter didn't just test individuals, it tested the entire structure of society. And yet, through all this, humour found a way to exist. Not modern, polished humour, but survival humour. The kind whispered by a parent while sweeping frost off the bed linens before anyone else woke up. The kind muttered while chipping ice off a water bucket for the 4th time before dawn. The kind shared between workers huddled near a public brazier, knowing the warmth was temporary but the joke was free. Because winter, in the 1800s, didn't care whether you were brave, organised, hopeful, or well-fed. It didn't ask for your preparedness level or your emotional bandwidth. It simply arrived, fully expecting you to adapt or suffer. And in that spirit we honour the season with the only humour that fits. Winter didn't ask how prepared you were. It just checked. If you lived in 1800s Europe, your home did not protect you from winter. It collaborated with it. Modern viewers imagine historical houses as rustic, cosy structures with warm fires and thick stone walls holding in the heat. Reality check. Those thick stone walls held in nothing except moisture, regret, and a lingering sense that your house might actually be rooting against you. Cold wasn't an unwelcome guest. It was a permanent resident, paying no rent and refusing to leave. Start with insulation. Actually, don't, because there wasn't any. Insulation as we understand it, fiberglass cavity walls, proper ceiling, simply didn't exist. Instead, houses breathed like living creatures, exhaling warmth and inhaling draughts with suspicious enthusiasm. Wind slid under doors, whistled through floorboards, and breezed past window frames with the confidence of someone who'd been given a spare key. The average family went through winter, accompanied by a consistent indoor wind speed of, why is the curtain moving when the window is closed? What did people do to fight these drafts? They got creative. They stuffed gaps with whatever could be wedged into the cracks. Cloth rags, animal hair, straw, moss, old paper, or, in moments of desperation, things that had absolutely no right being used as building materials. Newspapers became wall insulation not because it worked well, but because it was better than letting January stroll through your living room uninvited. The irony, of course, was that the news printed on those crumpled pages often involved weather reports that said things like, "exceptional frost expected," as if you needed a reminder while stuffing yesterday's headlines into a wall cavity. The walls themselves, often stone, brick or timber, absorbed the cold like sponges. Moisture seeped in easily, and once trapped, it made the interior even colder. Damp walls weren't just uncomfortable, they were health hazards. Mould crept across corners, frost formed indoors, and water running down the stone could refreeze, creating decorative but profoundly depressing ice features in your bedroom. People didn't worry about paint peeling. They worried about frost forming on the paint. Heating the entire home was an impossible dream for ordinary households. Instead, most families heated exactly one room, the kitchen, the main living space, or whatever room had the best hearth. Calling this a heated room is generous. The fire warmed a small radius directly around it, while the rest of the space remained comfortably within the light hypothermia range. People learned quickly that heat travelled unpredictably and grudgingly. You could be warm on the left side of your body and freezing on the right, creating a personal climate system that changed every time you rotated. Furniture placement became an art. Families nudged chairs, stools and workstations closer to the hearth, until they formed a tight ring of slightly warmer humans, orbiting a small, struggling fire. Yeah, children did homework at angles dictated not by ergonomics but by heat trajectories. Adults mended clothes, prepared meals, shelled beans, or read by firelight while leaning in with the aggressive commitment of someone trying to absorb warmth through osmosis. If you stepped away even a few feet, the temperature dropped so suddenly that it felt like walking through the pages of a meteorological cautionary tale. Bedrooms presented their own winter challenges. Without central heating, temperatures dropped dramatically at night, so people used bed curtains, fabric canopies designed to create a smaller, quasi-insulated microclimate around the mattress. These curtains trapped body heat, blocked drafts, and made it slightly less likely that you would wake up feeling like a decorative human icicle. In richer homes, bed hangings were ornate and luxurious. In poorer households, anything from patched linen to old blankets would do. They didn't have to be pretty. They just had to keep your nose from freezing while you slept. Of course, curtains didn't fix the truly cold nights. People often woke to frost on their blankets, ice in their water jugs, and frozen laundry that crackled ominously when touched. Sleeping with a warm brick or heated stone wrapped in cloth became standard practice. The brick eventually cooled, but you fell asleep faster trying to chase its last bit of warmth. Even with these adaptations, indoor life retained a high baseline of discomfort. Floors remained icy despite rugs. Doors rattled constantly. Window glass trapped condensation that froze into patterns that would be charming today, but signalled misery back then. Sometimes, the wind outside grew so strong that it whistled through keyholes. Yes, keyholes, producing unsettling nighttime musical accompaniment. The remarkable thing is that people didn't consider any of this unusual. Cold houses were simply normal houses. A home wasn't expected to keep winter out. It was expected to provide structure and a place to gather around a fire. Warmth was not a built-in feature. It was a scarce, manually produced commodity shared sparingly. Which leads to the humour of it all. The real comedic tragedy is that families didn't think their homes were failing. They thought this was how buildings were supposed to work. If a house today behaved like a house in 1800, we would call a contractor, file a complaint, send a strongly worded email, and maybe film it for social media. They, however, shrugged, added more layers, and carried on. Because in 19th century Europe, when someone complained that their home was cold, the universe replied, "Your house wasn't broken. This was the deluxe model." If the last part introduced the cold house, this one introduces the reason why it stayed cold. Fuel scarcity. In 1800s Europe, warmth wasn't simply the product of a fireplace. It was the product of your wallet, your boss's mood, your proximity to natural resources, and occasionally your willingness to burn something that probably shouldn't be burned. Heat was not an ambient household feature. Heat was a resource, the same way money is a resource. And winter was when your finances and your firewood coordinated to form a personal recession. Coal, wood, and peat formed the holy trinity of survival fuels. Coal was king in industrial regions, dense, hot-burning, and wonderfully efficient, but only if you could afford it. Wood dominated rural areas, though it disappeared alarmingly quickly when an entire region faced frost. Peat, the underappreciated cousin, fueled vast areas of Ireland, Scotland, and northern Europe. It was cut from bogs in warmer months and dried for winter. These fuels dictated everything from meal times to body temperature, and people learned quickly that weather forecasts mattered far less than coal prices. The relationship between heat and wealth was so blatant that Charles Dickens felt no need to explain it. He simply showed it. In A Christmas Carol, 1843, Ebenezer Scrooge keeps the office so cold that Bob Cratchit's fire is described as one coal. Not metaphorically, literally one. A piece of carbon glowing with the faint enthusiasm of someone who wanted to retire early. Dickens didn't exaggerate for effect. He reported a reality familiar to clerks, apprentices, and shop assistants throughout the century. Employers controlled the workplace fire, and therefore controlled comfort, productivity, and morale. The smaller the fire, the larger the boss's savings. Simple math, miserable employees. And if workplaces were cold, homes weren't much better. Households rationed fuel with the precision of surgeons, except their tools were tongs and their patients were shivering family members. Burning fuel too quickly meant running out before winter ended. Burning too slowly meant frostbite indoors. Coal bins were monitored like locked treasure chests. Some families counted pieces of coal as carefully as others counted coins. They were, in a sense, the same thing. Fuel shortages had direct consequences far beyond temperature. No heat meant no cooking. Many families could not prepare proper meals without a fire, especially in areas dependent on boiling, baking or stewing staple foods. Grain or potatoes might be available, but uncooked, they were useless, or worse, hazardous. Winter hunger wasn't always caused by a lack of food. Often it was caused by a lack of heat to make that food edible. The irony was bleak. Your survival depended on both calories and combustion. Missing either was a problem, but missing the second meant the first didn't matter. This created a strange hierarchy of household tasks. Lighting and maintaining the fire wasn't just a chore, it was a profession. One misplaced spark, one poorly positioned log, or one moment of inattention could waste precious heat or let the fire die prematurely. Reigniting it took time, kindling and fuel, all resources that winter guarded with petty territorial instinct. Many families maintained the fire overnight using slow-burning methods, hoping to wake up to embers rather than a dark hearth that greeted them with the crisp, unfriendly honesty of a new cold day. Different regions had different fuel cultures. Urban areas relied heavily on coal deliveries, which were expensive and sometimes unreliable during storms. Rural communities might cut wood, but wood takes time to dry, and few things are more demoralizing than watching smoke pour into the room, because your logs are soggy, and winter refuses to apologize. Peat-cutting families had to collect months' worth of fuel in summer, stack it, dry it, or transport it, and hope no unexpected dampness ruined the stores. Peat was cheaper, yes, but you had to work for it, vigorously, strategically, and with the foreknowledge that winter would be grading your effort later. For the poor, acquiring fuel became a risky form of creativity. Scavenging scrap wood, collecting fallen branches, or even gathering discarded boxes could add minutes of warmth. Some burned broken furniture, some burned debris. Some burned anything that technically shouldn't burn but could, if winter made the argument compelling enough. There's historical comfort in knowing that burn first, ask questions later was once a widely shared philosophy. Fuel also shaped social behaviour. Many trades required outdoor tasks, delivering coal, chopping wood, carting loads. These workers braved freezing conditions so others could stay warm. But when a community's fuel ran low, even their work stopped. Winter narrowed the entire economy to a simple question. Who has heat today? Banks, churches, factories and offices all shrank their operational hours based on fuel supplies. Warmth was not just comfort. It was infrastructure. And there was a psychological dimension too. A dwindling coal pile could trigger genuine anxiety. The sound of coal being shoveled out of a storage bin was both reassuring, heat today, and terrifying, less heat tomorrow. Families argued about fire management the way modern families argue about thermostats. Except lowering the heat in 1800 didn't mean mild discomfort. It meant potential sickness. Fuel was so central to survival that it created its own cultural shorthand. A household could be judged by the warmth of its fire. A workshop's reputation was tied to how warm it kept its workers. A miserly employer like Scrooge was condemned not for being mean, but for being cheap with coal, a crime that, in winter, bordered on villainy. All of this leads to the chapter's overarching truth. Heat was not guaranteed. It was purchased, measured, rationed, negotiated, and sometimes begged for. Winter didn't just chill the body, it chilled the economy, the household, and the social order. Because in 1800s Europe, warmth wasn't a right. Warmth was a privilege with a budget. If you picture a cosy 19th century European home with multiple crackling fireplaces warming each room like a cheerful Christmas card, erase that image immediately. winter in the 1800s meant one thing for most families. One fire, singular, central. Overworked, underfunded. It was the household engine, the emotional support system, the cooking appliance, and the only thing standing between your family and becoming a decorative frost sculpture. Every winter, families gravitated toward the single heated room like migrating birds with terrible luck. This room, usually the kitchen or main living space, was not chosen because it was the prettiest or the most convenient. It was chosen because it had the hearth, and therefore, by default, became the room where all life happened. If you wanted warmth, you went there. If you wanted to see your family, you had no choice. If you wanted privacy, well, winter sent its regrets. Let's set the scene. The fire burns in the hearth, but not as brightly as you might imagine. Flames in 1800s, Europe were rarely allowed to dance freely. They were kept in a state of economic responsibility, smouldering rather than roaring. A fire that burned too fiercely wasted precious fuel. A fire that burned too low wasted precious dignity. So families aimed for the middle, a small, respectable flame that produced enough heat to keep suffering at a moderate level. Around this modest fire, every activity of daily life unfolded. Cooking happened there, often with pots hung from hooks or placed directly in the coals. Mending clothes, shelling peas, spinning thread, repairing tools, and chopping small vegetables all occurred within reach of the hearth. Meals were eaten within that radius too, partly because warmth made food taste better, but mostly because stepping away from the fire meant stepping back into the frozen tundra, otherwise known as the rest of the house. Even furniture arrangement reflected this reality. Chairs were lined up in semicircles facing the fire like church pews worshipping heat. Stools, benches, crates, and even overturned buckets were repurposed as seating in the sacred warm zone. People sat close enough to feel the heat on their shins, but not so close that their socks began to smoulder. Though let it be known, that line was occasionally crossed. Because one central room served everyone, winter rearranged family dynamics. Children played as quietly as possible in the corners, trying not to knock anything over. Adults negotiated space like diplomats in a territorial dispute. Whoever tended the fire wielded disproportionate power, holding the tongs like a royal sceptre. Pets stationed themselves so close to the hearth that they achieved a level of heat-based bliss forbidden to humans. And someone always had to give up their seat whenever a relative entered the room, leading to brisk negotiations and whispered accusations. But the prized position, the warm seat, the apex of thermal comfort, was located directly in front of the fire, and that seat was not won casually. It was earned through a combination of timing, persistence, and shameless opportunism. If a family member stood up to fetch something, even for a moment, the warm seat became fair game. A sibling might slide into it without maintaining eye contact. An elder might declare it rightfully theirs due to household seniority. A parent might insist, "I need this spot. I'm doing chores," even when the chore looked suspiciously like sitting. Rotations formed naturally, though not necessarily peacefully. Everyone wanted a turn, and burns on the shins were a badge of honour. Children learned early the art of hovering near the seat's edge, ready to pounce the moment someone shifted. Adults honed their ability to balance politeness with practical survival. It was musical chairs, winter edition, without the music, and with significantly higher emotional stakes. Outside the hearth room, winter claimed the rest of the house as its personal empire. Bedrooms transformed into walk-in freezers. Hallways became wind tunnels. Storage spaces developed frost textures that would have impressed a modern ice sculptor. Entire sections of a house went unused from December to March, not out of preference, but because entering them unnecessarily was considered an act of seasonal self-harm. This abandonment created a strange spatial compression. Families lived their entire lives in a single room for months, navigating tight quarters, constant closeness, and the background soundtrack of crackling wood and occasional sighs of despair. Yet, there was surprising tenderness in this forced togetherness. Shared warmth meant shared stories, shared meals, shared projects, and shared frustration when someone accidentally blocked too much of the fire's heat. For many, the hearthroom functioned as a survival command centre. Each morning began with coaxing the embers back into flame, followed by a strategic assessment. How many hours of warmth can we stretch today? How many logs can we spare? How long can we cook without losing heat? These were daily calculations, performed with the seriousness of military planning but the stakes of domestic life. And when night arrived, the room shifted again. Families pulled bedding close to the hearth, creating makeshift sleeping arrangements. The fire would be dampened for safety, leaving only glowing embers, just enough warmth to make the difference between tolerable sleep and waking up as a resemble of a snow-dusted spirit. In the end, the hearthroom was the heart of winter survival. It gathered families, shaped routines, and orchestrated daily life with the simple promise of not freezing. Comfort was not guaranteed, but compared to the frozen universe outside that room, it was luxury. Because in 19th century Europe, getting the warm seat wasn't just luck, it was a competitive sport. The warm seat required patience, strategy, and moral compromise. Nighttime in 1800s, Europe was not peaceful, private, or remotely luxurious. It was a strategic operation, a nightly arrangement designed around a single biological truth. Bodies produce heat, and winter wants that heat badly. If you wished to greet the morning without frost decorating your eyebrows, you didn't sleep alone, you slept together, and not in the romantic candlelit way novels like to describe. No, this was communal sleeping, born from necessity, physics, and the shared dream of seeing spring. Bed sharing stretched across regions, cultures, and social classes. In rural farms, cottages, and even urban households, it was entirely normal and widely expected that multiple people would pile into a single bed. Families packed themselves in for maximum warmth. Parents, children, grandparents, visiting relatives, and occasionally a servant or two. If a family owned more than one bed, it didn't matter. Or everyone gravitated toward the one warmer sleeping place like frostbitten penguins performing a survival waltz. This practice created sleeping arrangements that would shock modern sensibilities. A traveller visiting a friend could fully expect to be told, "We've made space for you in the bed," with no mention of separate rooms because there were no separate rooms. At inns, strangers often shared beds without complaint. It wasn't unusual for someone to wake up in the middle of the night and greet a travelling merchant they'd never met who'd been added to the sleeping roster for warmth efficiency. Even wealthier households embraced shared sleeping, though they approached it with slightly more elegance. They used bed curtains, fabric hangings that created a miniature enclosed chamber. These curtains acted like early insulation, trapping body heat and blocking drafts that sneaked in from every wall, floorboard, and window crack. Picture a canopy bed, but instead of luxury, think survival tent with decorative aspirations. And then there were the mattresses. Forget memory foam or down-filled wonders. Most people slept on straw mattresses stuffed and restuffed throughout the year. Straw was affordable, breathable, and reasonably comfortable until it compacted, poked through the fabric, or began to smell like something that had been alive recently and was unhappy about its afterlife. In winter, fresh straw was added to increase insulation. Families fluffed and rearranged their bedding not for softness, but for heat retention. You wanted as much straw as possible between you and the icy planks masquerading as a floor. But bedding wasn't the only thing sacrificing dignity in the name of warmth. Privacy took a nosedive too. Winter demolished the concept. If you needed to change clothes, everyone politely looked away, or pretended to. If someone snored, everyone endured it. If a child kicked in their sleep, someone absorbed the blow. The night was a communal event, and everyone contributed something: heat, space, or unintentional elbow jabs. Children naturally were walking radiators. No one admitted it openly, but placing a child in the middle of the bed was a popular heating strategy. babies and toddlers were wrapped tightly, tucked between adults, and checked frequently to prevent them from rolling into cold spots. Even servants, especially young maids, might be invited to share the family bed in winter, not for emotional closeness but because an extra body was an extra degree. Sleeping positions became an art. Most families defaulted to the stacked spoon method, facing the same way so breaths wouldn't freeze on each other's noses. Others slept back to back, creating a wall of heat between their spines. Some even rotated positions during the night to keep every part of the body equally warm, though such choreography required a level of cooperation rarely seen in households with more than one teenager. And then there was the problem of cold sheets. In a room without heating, sheets felt less like fabric and more like thin slabs of refrigerated disappointment. The bravest, or most unlucky, person was tasked with getting into bed first to warm the spot for everyone else. Families treated this role with the seriousness of volunteer fire brigades. Sometimes it fell to the youngest, sometimes to the eldest. Most often it fell to the person who hesitated at the doorway the longest, a fatal tactical error. For those with animals, winter added another layer of shared sleeping. Cats curled up on feet, small dogs nestled against legs. Even chickens occasionally slept indoors during the coldest nights, though rarely in the bed itself. Every warm body counted. Despite the discomfort, shared sleeping gave families something valuable, a sense of safety. Winter nights were long, silent, and often frightening. Wind howled against fragile walls, frost crept across floors, and the cold pressed in from every direction. Sleeping together provided emotional reassurance, a bulwark against both the temperature and the eerie stillness outside. Many families told stories before bed, whispered prayers, or recited old tales as they settled in, creating a cultural ritual born from hardship. And yes, there were awkward moments. Morning breath existed. Sleep-talking existed. People rolled over and accidentally stole blankets. Someone inevitably snored with a talent that defied physics. But all of this was a small price to pay for the warmth that collective sleeping offered. Because in the 1800s, sharing a bed wasn't intimate, luxurious, or scandalous. It was survival math. More bodies meant more heat. More heat meant more life. Or, put another way, romantic. No, efficient. Absolutely. In 1800s, Europe, winter didn't merely influence the clothing you wore. It dictated it, micromanaged it, and judged you harshly if you got it wrong. Your wardrobe wasn't a collection of outfits. It was a defensive system. Cold air didn't negotiate, so clothing became the physical barrier between your body and the season that wanted to turn you into a commemorative ice statue. Homes weren't warm, streets weren't warm, workplaces weren't warm, so your clothing had to be. The undisputed monarch of winter survival was wool. Wool reigned not because it was luxurious, but because it was stubbornly functional. It held heat, wicked moisture, resisted wind, and, most importantly, kept insulating even when damp. If winter had an arch nemesis, it was a thick wool garment. Sweaters, petticoats, stockings, wraps, cloaks, shawls. The more wool you wore, the better your odds of waking up without numb extremities. Sheep were not just farm animals. They were winter's silent heroes. But wool alone wasn't enough. Clothing strategy in the 19th century was all about layers, and not the fashionable, tastefully coordinated layers you see on modern winter runways. These were survival layers, layers that bulked you up to the point where your mobility decreased by 20%, but your body temperature increased by enough to prevent catastrophe. People wore shirts under shirts, skirts over skirts, stockings under stockings, indoors. Because yes, in winter, you dressed inside your home the same way modern people dress to shovel a driveway. In cold months, families put on everything they owned at once, creating silhouettes that range from pillowed armour to mobile haystack. You didn't dress to impress, you dressed to endure, and winter did not care whether you could bend your elbows. Well, one reason winter clothing felt particularly heavy was that garments were rarely washed during the season. It wasn't laziness, it was strategy. Washing wool stripped it of its natural oils, the oils that made it insulating and semi-waterproof. Removing them in winter would have been an unforgivable tactical mistake. Wool garments were spot-cleaned, brushed, beaten and aired out near fires, but fully washing them was avoided until the weather warmed. If a wool coat smelled lived in, that meant it was working. Winter wasn't the time to worry about freshness, it was the time to worry about frostbite. Because clothing was so essential, it was repaired constantly. Needles, thread and darning tools saw more action in winter than in any other season. People fixed tears, patched holes, rewove thinning fabric and reinforced elbows and knees. A well-mended sleeve was a badge of honour, not a fashion failure. If a garment looked entirely untouched, it meant you weren't working hard, weren't outdoors, or had supernatural luck. The culture of repair also meant that hand-me-downs were a universal experience. A new coat might serve 3 siblings, then a cousin, then a younger neighbour, then a scarecrow. Clothes had life cycles. A garment began as Sunday best, then became weekday clothing, then workwear, then patch material for other garments, and finally insulation stuffed into cracks or wrapped around fragile objects. Winter ensured nothing was wasted. And winter clothing wasn't just thick, it was inventive. People improvised constantly. Old rags became foot wrappings, shawls doubled as hoods, aprons became makeshift windbreakers, scarves weren't fashion accessories, they were lifelines. A well-wrapped scarf could prevent your lungs from seizing in the frigid morning air, and people wrapped theirs with the dedication of someone trying to smuggle warmth out of the atmosphere. Footwear was another battlefield. Leather stiffened in the cold, cracked easily, and absorbed moisture. To counter this, people stuffed shoes with straw or wool scraps for extra insulation. Some wore multiple pairs of socks, each repaired to the point where the original thread was basically a rumour. Boots were greased heavily, partly to waterproof them, partly to keep them flexible, and partly because winter had a personal vendetta against human toes. For children, the seasonal wardrobe problem became even more chaotic. Kids grew quickly, but winter garments did not. This meant children often wore clothing slightly too small or dramatically too large, depending on where they fell in the family lineup. A child with sleeves covering their hands wasn't making a fashion statement. They were wearing their sibling's coat from 2 years ago, rolled up 3 times out of necessity. The result was a society that marched through winter looking like it had collectively lost a fight with a textile warehouse. People didn't glide, they waddled, they didn't stride confidently, they shuffled, burdened by layers that added mass but removed grace. Bending over took planning. Dropping something on the floor was grounds for emotional collapse. Despite all of this, winter clothing rituals created a peculiar sense of unity. The morning routine of layering was a communal event. Parents inspected children's outfits like military officers checking armour before battle. Neighbours exchanged tips on darning techniques or wool softening tricks. Entire communities understood the shared misery of cold seams and stiff fabric. And while fashion did exist in the 1800s, winter had no interest in it. Whatever beauty standards society tried to enforce simply slid off under the weight of necessity. Winter was a strict stylistic critic. If an outfit didn't trap heat effectively, it didn't matter how attractive it looked. Ultimately, clothing was the body's last defence. Homes leaked, streets froze, work didn't stop, and fires couldn't follow you outside. But your clothes stayed with you through every freezing moment, patched, bulky, slightly odorous, and utterly essential. Because in 19th century Europe, survival came first, and comfort came second, and aesthetics didn't even make the list. Or, as Winter would put it, fashion was about survival, not self-expression. In 1800s Europe, the phrase keeping warm belonged in the same category as hosting a royal banquet, or taking a vacation. Theoretically pleasant, but financially unrealistic. Winter exaggerated every inequality, but nowhere was the divide clearer than in the world of fuel poverty, a condition so widespread that even the middle class occasionally found themselves staring at a dwindling coal pile with the same dread one reserves for a collapsing roof or an unexpected tax bill. Coal prices rose almost every winter. This wasn't a surprise. It was a seasonal ritual, like frost on the windows or grandparents complaining about drafts. Merchants knew demand would spike when the first cold winds arrived. People could complain, but coal did not care. Coal was very aware of its own importance, and it priced itself accordingly. Wood and peat suffered the same seasonal inflation, but coal, hotter, denser, and more efficient, was the real currency of comfort. The poor responded by rationing fuel with an intensity normally associated with military campaigns. Firewood or coal wasn't just a household resource, it was a strategy. Families burned less during the day, lighting fires only for cooking or essential warmth. Evenings were shortened not because people were sleepy, but because sitting together in the dark saved fuel. If a fire was lit at all, it was kept deliberately small, just enough to take the bite out of the air without costing tomorrow's survival. In the fuel poverty hierarchy of needs, warmth came before food. This wasn't a philosophical statement, it was practical physics. Your body could survive hunger longer than it could survive freezing. A poorly heated room drained energy faster than a thin stew ever could. This meant poor families rationed fuel before they rationed meals. If you needed to boil potatoes, you boiled enough for multiple meals. If you baked bread, you baked in batches. If you needed hot water, you used it for everything: tea, washing, cleaning, before it cooled. When things grew desperate and winter excelled at accelerating desperation, people turned to creative, morally grey, or outright dangerous solutions. Fuel theft climbed every time the temperature dropped. Coal was stolen from delivery carts, shared bins, storage yards, or even directly from the piles outside wealthier homes. Children were often sent to scavenge loose lumps on the roadside after a coal wagon passed. These weren't crimes of opportunity. They were crimes of survival. A single piece of coal might keep a fire alive long enough to cook porridge or warm a sick child. Those who couldn't steal often burned anything that would ignite. Broken furniture, wooden tools, discarded boxes, worn-out baskets, roofing scraps, and even floorboards, in truly desperate situations, became emergency fuel. Winter turned every item in a home into a potential source of heat, and families surveyed their belongings with the same question: will this burn? If the answer was yes, the object's sentimental value instantly plummeted. A chair with a missing leg? Fuel. A tool handle cracked beyond repair? Fuel. A decorative wooden trinket no one really liked anyway? And definitely fuel. Middle-class families faced a different kind of struggle. They could still buy fuel, but not without feeling the sting of rising winter costs. Fires were restricted to 1 or 2 rooms, even in larger houses. Servants were instructed to keep fires low, sometimes to the point of uselessness. A household known for burning bright fires during harsh winters was seen as extravagant. Rich, certainly, but also irresponsible, as if they were taunting the season itself. Respectability meant moderation, and winter monitored every mantelpiece. Fuel merchants held enormous seasonal power. Their deliveries could make or break a household's comfort. When storms blocked roads or rivers froze, coal shipments stalled, creating shortages even in cities that normally had steady supply lines. Urban families panicked when bins grew empty, while rural families watched their carefully gathered wood piles shrink too quickly. Everyone felt winter's pressure in the same way one feels the slow, ominous drip of water from a ceiling. You can't ignore it, and you know it's only going to get worse. In some regions, communities created informal fuel-sharing networks. Neighbours lent small amounts of wood or coal with the unspoken agreement that debts would be repaid once conditions improved. But debts of warmth were delicate. People remembered who helped them and who didn't, long after the snow melted. Winter shaped reputations. A generous household earned loyalty. A selfish one earned resentment and suspicious glances at the marketplace. The psychological toll of low fuel stores was intense. Families checked their wood piles obsessively, and counting logs and estimating how many days remained before the dreaded moment when the last piece would burn to ash. Once fuel ran out, the home became a freezer, and families shifted from managing winter to enduring it. This was when the most desperate decisions were made. Imagine the scene. A family gathered around a fire so small it barely illuminated their faces. The room is silent except for the crackling of a single insufficient log. Everyone stares into the flame not because it's beautiful, but because they're calculating how much longer it will last. Tension hangs in the air alongside the cold. Someone looks at an old wooden stool. Someone else looks away. Someone whispers, "We can fix it later." They won't fix it later. By the late stages of winter, your even relatively comfortable households operated on the understanding that everything had value as potential kindling. Furniture grew suspicious. Tools feared retirement. Anything wooden felt a little nervous. Winter, after all, was not sentimental. Fuel poverty determined who shivered and who merely complained. It set the boundary between discomfort and danger. It shaped diets, sleep, daily routines, and survival outcomes. It was an unspoken social dividing line and a brutally honest economic mirror. Because in winter, money didn't reveal itself through clothing or furniture. It revealed itself through warmth. And winter had no trouble identifying who had heat and who didn't. After all, if it burned, it counted. Winter in 1800s, Europe didn't need dramatic blizzards or collapsing roofs to kill. It had a quieter, a more efficient method: illness. Not the kind that confined you to bed with a warm drink and a sympathetic note from your employer. No, these were illnesses that stalked you in your own home and took advantage of every draught, every cough, and every moment your body let its guard down. If cold was the first enemy of winter, disease was the second, and the two worked together with disturbingly good teamwork. The cold season amplified respiratory illnesses like tuberculosis, bronchitis, and pneumonia, conditions that were widespread in the 19th century even during milder weather. Winter transformed them from chronic threats into deadly weapons. The human body struggled to stay warm, the immune system weakened, lungs became more vulnerable. A simple cough in November could become a funeral by January. Symptoms that today prompt a quick trip to the clinic were, in the 1800s, ominous signs of danger. A rattling chest, a fever that worsened at night, shallow breathing, or coughing up blood, all were terrifyingly common. Entire families lived in fear of someone developing winter lungs, a vague phrase that covered all manner of respiratory miseries. Once a person became seriously ill, the household braced for a long and uncertain battle, fought without modern treatments, antibiotics, or even reliable diagnostic tools. And winter made everything worse. Cold air irritated inflamed airways, prolonging illness. Homes rarely warmed evenly, so a sick person might be wrapped in blankets near a struggling fire while icy drafts snuck in from every direction. Walking outside was risky, and breathing cold air could trigger coughing fits severe enough to cause vomiting or choking. Especially in cities, winter air wasn't crisp and clean. It was thick with coal smoke and industrial pollution, which only worsened the respiratory load. But winter had another trick. The way households heated themselves often created deadly indoor environments. Unlike modern heating, which doesn't require combustion inside living spaces, families in the 1800s relied on fires that burned constantly, but poorly. Fires were kept low to save fuel, but that often meant incomplete combustion, which produced more smoke. Chimneys were frequently cold or clogged, preventing proper ventilation. Some cottages didn't have full chimneys at all, relying instead on small openings in the roof, which winter happily tried to close with frost. This resulted in rooms filled with lingering smoke that irritated lungs, triggered wheezing, and deposited soot inside airways. Children breathed it, infants breathed it, the elderly breathed it, the sick breathed it, making recovery harder. Modern people complain about smoky campfires outdoors. Imagine living beside one for months on end, indoors, with no escape except the cold. Carbon monoxide, though not understood scientifically at the time, was another silent killer. Low fires, especially those that smouldered overnight, produced dangerous fumes. Families dampened fires before bed to conserve fuel, but a poorly vented hearth could fill the room with poisonous gases as the fire burned low. People sometimes woke dizzy, nauseated, or faint, if they woke at all. Winter nights claimed countless victims, their passing attributed vaguely to fever or weakness, when the truth was that they simply never breathed enough clean air. Crowded living conditions amplified these dangers. Families who slept together for warmth also shared air and germs. A single coughing child could spread illness through the household in days. A labourer who returned from work with a mild chill might transmit something far more serious. Winter wasn't just cold, it was contagious. The medical world, meanwhile, was limited in its toolkit. Doctors could offer warm drinks, poultices, bleeding, unfortunately, rest, and prayers. No antibiotics, no oxygen therapy, no steroids. Advice often included keeping the patient warm and ventilating the room, two instructions that Winter found personally offensive. Opening a window to let out smoke let in freezing air. Keeping the room warm risked consuming too much fuel. Doing one undermined the other. Families improvised. Windows were cracked open strategically for moments at a time. Blankets were layered. Chairs were dragged closer to the fire, but illnesses still spread. Winter forced people into close quarters, turning the hearth room into a petri dish. And unlike today, where we can isolate the sick, in the 1800s, isolation meant sending someone into a freezing room to get worse alone, not exactly a viable remedy. In rural areas, smoke inhalation was nearly universal during winter. Cottages burned peat or wood in low-lying hearths that produced dense fumes. Chimneys were narrow and easily blocked by soot build-up or winter debris. Some households used small braziers, which were efficient but notoriously prone to filling rooms with carbon monoxide if not monitored constantly. Households knew their fires might harm them, but without fuel and flame, the cold would harm them faster. City dwellers faced a different hazard: air pollution. Industrial coal burned in factories and workshops filled the air with particles that irritated lungs and weakened resistance to infection. Dense winter fogs, infamous pea soupers, drifted into homes and worsened symptoms. A London winter could feel like breathing inside a chimney, and not a clean one. Children suffered the most. Their bodies lost heat quickly, their immune systems were less developed, and their smaller lungs could not withstand prolonged exposure to smoke. Infant mortality rose sharply in winter months, and respiratory diseases were common causes, and parents watched their children anxiously, listening for every cough and praying it didn't deepen into something worse. The tragic truth was that winter illness did not need to be dramatic to be deadly. It could slip quietly into a household, settle in someone's chest, and linger for weeks until the body simply gave up. People genuinely feared the sound of a persistent winter cough, one of the era's most ominous soundtracks. And yet, despite all the misery, winter heating strategies carried a dark comedic irony. The fire that kept you alive could also slowly suffocate you. Warmth, such as it was, came with a smoky price. Families clustered near the hearth for comfort, completely aware that they were inhaling things no human lung should enthusiastically greet. Which is why the chapter's humour isn't just a joke, it's an accurate summary of the season's grim logic. The fire kept you warm, the smoke finished the job. Winter in 1800s. Europe didn't just test bodies, it tested pride, and pride was often the more stubborn opponent. If cold could sneak through cracks in the walls, pride could sneak into decision-making. In the working poor of the 19th century, dignity wasn't decorative, it was fundamental to identity. And nowhere is that clearer than in the interviews recorded by Henry Mayhew, whose mid-century work London Labour and the London Poor captured the quiet, painful realities hidden beneath the frost of Victorian streets. Mayhew documented a pattern repeated across countless households. People would rather freeze in their own homes than ask for help from the parish. Accepting poor relief meant acknowledging defeat. Entering the workhouse meant surrendering autonomy entirely. Winter pressed in with both hands, but for many asking for help felt worse. To understand why, you have to imagine the emotional economy of the era. A family's survival often depended on stock money, a small reserve that acted as working capital. It could be a few coins saved for emergencies, or income from a small business, or the extra cushion a labourer relied on when work fluctuated. Stock money wasn't wealth, it was permission to keep going, and Winter erased it with remarkable efficiency. In Mayhew's interviews, illness frequently triggered financial collapse. A single fever, a cough that kept a worker bedridden for a week, or a minor injury could wipe out stock money instantly. Without income, families couldn't pay rent, couldn't buy fuel, and couldn't purchase the food needed to keep the household functioning. Illness wasn't just a medical problem, it was an economic catastrophe. And yet, even when finances spiraled, many families refused to turn to the parish for relief. Why? Because poor relief wasn't simply assistance. It came with layers of shame, bureaucracy, and social judgment. For one thing, entering the workhouse meant losing personal freedom. Families knew this intimately. Husbands and wives were often separated into different wards. Children could be assigned to their own dormitories. Workhouses operated like institutions, not homes. Meals were scheduled, labour was compulsory, and every aspect of daily life was regulated. Once inside, you were no longer an independent adult. You were a dependent subject under the poor law system. Or even receiving outdoor relief, help while staying at home, carried a stigma. Neighbours noticed. Gossip circulated. People talked about those who couldn't get through winter without help, as if winter itself weren't an unreasonable force of nature. Respectability mattered deeply, especially to labourers whose pride in their self-sufficiency defined their sense of worth. One Mayhew interview recalls a woman who described how her husband refused to go to the parish, even when he was too sick to work. Their stock money dwindled, their savings vanished, and when things became dire, he still resisted. He wouldn't hear of the union, not because relief wouldn't help them, but because admitting the need would crush him. Their survival depended on a small loan instead, money offered by someone outside the system, preserving their pride just long enough to make it through. For families like this, pride and poverty were intertwined. Poverty wasn't just a lack of resources, it was a social marker, and winter made that marker glow in neon. Asking for help turned a temporary hardship into a permanent label. Winter placed impossible pressure on working-class identity. Men were expected to provide. Women were expected to maintain the home. Children were expected to behave and contribute when possible. When a household faltered under the weight of freezing wind and empty coal scuttles, it wasn't simply seen as a practical failure, it was seen as a personal one. Society had a harsh philosophy. Those who could manage did. Those who couldn't ended up in the workhouse. Winter, therefore, became the ultimate test of self-sufficiency. This cultural expectation led to astonishing acts of stubbornness. Families would pawn essential possessions rather than ask for relief. They would cut meals down to the bare minimum. They would wrap themselves in every scrap of fabric they owned. They would endure rooms so cold that the air seemed to crystallize around their breath. And through all of this they would insist, "We're managing." But the cracks showed, and Mayhew captured them. He wrote about pride quietly breaking under the weight of sickness, about families whose self-sufficiency turned into self-endangerment. His work reveals a world where people battled cold weather with wool, fires, and shared sleeping, but battled shame with silence. The tragedy is that help did exist. The parish system, flawed as it was, existed to prevent starvation and exposure. But pride built a wall too high for many to climb over. Winter chipped away at the wall, illness cracked it, debt rattled it. Yet households held firm, insisting that survival must come from their own efforts, not from the institution whose aid came packaged with humiliation. The workhouse loomed as a symbol of ultimate defeat. People equated it with the loss of identity, To be admitted meant admitting that winter had won, and winter, already an unforgiving season, didn't need any encouragement. This psychological battle between suffering privately and seeking relief publicly defined many working-class winters. If the cold didn't get you, the pride might. Pride wasn't a luxury. It was a survival instinct as powerful as hunger or warmth. It kept people pushing forward, but it also kept them refusing help until the last possible moment. And that is the essence of this chapter. Winter exposed not only physical vulnerability, but emotional ones as well. Pride kept households fighting long past the point where common sense suggested surrender. It lengthened suffering, delayed solutions, and made winter a harsher adversary than any storm. Because sometimes, in 19th century Europe, the season wasn't the coldest thing in the house. Pride kept you cold longer than the weather. If winter was the season that squeezed families until every coin, calorie, and scrap of warmth was gone, then the workhouse was the institution waiting at the end of that squeeze. It didn't lurk maliciously. It simply existed, as immovable and imposing as the frost on a January morning. After the 1834 Poor Law reforms in Britain, workhouses became the primary form of indoor relief. A euphemistic phrase meaning you will be sheltered, but you will not enjoy it. The 1834 reforms transformed the old poor relief system into something far harsher. Lawmakers believed that help should be given only under conditions strict enough to deter anyone who wasn't absolutely desperate. Their guiding principle was known as the less eligibility doctrine. No person receiving relief should ever be as comfortable as the lowest paid labourer who supported themselves. In other words, the poorest free worker should always have a better life than the person getting assistance. Compassion was replaced with efficiency, and efficiency came wrapped in punishment. Workhouses became the physical expression of this philosophy. From the outside, they often resembled prisons. Tall, cold stone buildings with barred windows, locked gates, and high walls. Inside, they operated with military precision. Rules governed everything. When you woke, when you worked, when you ate, when you prayed, when you slept, and even how you walked. Nothing about the workhouse was designed to restore dignity. It was designed to test your willingness to endure discomfort in exchange for survival. For those entering during winter, the contrast between conditions outside and conditions inside was deeply conflicted. On one hand, the workhouse offered things that mattered desperately in the cold months: guaranteed food, however limited, guaranteed shelter, however bleak, and guaranteed heat, however controlled. On the other hand, these basic necessities came at the cost of autonomy, privacy, and family unity. One of the most painful policies was family separation. Husbands and wives were divided into different wards. Children were separated by age and gender. Infants were often placed in nurseries. Couples could not share meals, much less sleeping quarters. Parents saw their children only at designated times, and even then, interactions were limited. Winter reunited families in their own homes. The workhouse tore them apart again. This fragmentation wasn't accidental, it was intentional. Lawmakers believed that if life inside the workhouse was too bearable, people would seek relief unnecessarily. So they made sure that entering the workhouse meant giving up not only comfort, but the emotional bonds that defined everyday life. Work in the workhouse was another tool used to discourage dependency. Men broke stones, ground grain, chopped wood, moved heavy loads, or performed monotonous tasks for hours. Women washed laundry, scrubbed floors, sewed uniforms, or prepared meals. Even children had assignments suited to their age, often repetitive or exhausting. The goal wasn't skill building. The goal was deterrence. If you left the workhouse on your own accord, the administration considered that a success. And yet, winter gave the workhouse a paradoxical appeal. Outside, families shivered around dwindling fires, starved due to lack of fuel for cooking, and watched illnesses spread unchecked. Inside, the heat, however carefully rationed, was consistent. Food, however bland, was reliable. Clothing, however institutional, was dry. Winter forced thousands into a choice between freezing with dignity or warming up without it. Workhouses increased their regimentation in winter because that was when the largest influx of desperate applicants arrived. Administrators tightened schedules, increased inspections, and maintained strict discipline to keep order among growing populations. Privacy shrank, noise increased, tension simmered. But winter didn't allow people the luxury of avoiding these conditions. The season pushed them in with the inevitability of hunger and cold. The moral judgment layered onto this system made everything worse. Entering the workhouse branded a person, not with ink, but with reputation. Neighbours knew, communities whispered. Some believed poverty was a personal failing, not a product of brutal economic swings, seasonal unemployment, or illness. Women who entered risked being viewed as immoral. Men risked being dismissed as irresponsible. Even children carried the social stain. Despite all this, workhouses did serve an essential function. They prevented death on a massive scale. They sheltered the elderly who had no family support. They fed children whose parents could not. They offered stability when winter turned the outside world into a landscape of scarcity. But their purpose, to assist without encouraging dependence, meant compassion was rationed just as tightly as fuel. Inside the workhouse, warmth existed, but not comfort. Food existed, but not choice. Shelter existed, but not home. You were alive, clothed, and fed, but stripped of everything that made life feel like your own. Which brings us to the small, dark irony of the entire system. Yes, the workhouse kept you warm during winter, but along with the warmth came rules, humiliation, rigidity, and emotional isolation, conditions cold enough in their own way. Or, here as winter itself might summarize it, the warmth was real, the dignity was optional. If you imagine a warm workhouse kitchen serving steaming porridges and hearty stews during winter, erase that fantasy immediately. The diet provided under the post-1834 Poor Law system was not designed for comfort, strength, or even basic satisfaction. It was designed for one purpose only: to discourage you from wanting it. Food in the workhouse was not nourishment. It was policy in edible form. The Poor Law Commission, along with local boards of guardians, created and enforced dietary tables that spelled out exactly how much food each inmate received. These weren't guidelines. They were mathematical formulas masquerading as meals. The goal was not to maintain health in the best possible way. It was to maintain bodies at the lowest acceptable threshold of survival, ensuring no one willingly chose the workhouse over paid labour. So what did a typical winter day look like on a workhouse menu? Breakfast might consist of 7 ounces of bread, a slice roughly the size of your resolve, and 1.5 pints of gruel. Gruel, for those fortunate enough never to have encountered it, was an oat or barley mixture cooked in water until it reached a consistency that hovered uncomfortably between liquid and regret. If it was thick, it was considered indulgent. If it was thin, it was considered normal. No one in charge felt pressured to err on the side of generosity. Lunch, depending on the workhouse and the dietary table used, could include soup or a basic pudding. Soup was rarely hearty. It usually resembled salted warm water with a few floating bits of vegetable, if any were available. Puddings were often soot-based, dense, heavy, and filling in the same way a damp brick is filling. Meat, when served, was tightly portioned, boiled to exhaustion, and stripped of flavour with bureaucratic enthusiasm. Dinner might be more bread, or gruel again, or potatoes. Nothing extravagant, nothing flavourful, nothing that would cause an inmate to think, yes, I'd like to stay here forever. The Poor Law system regarded pleasure with suspicion and calories with caution. The diets were deliberately inferior to the meals eaten by the poorest free labourers outside the workhouse. This was not speculation. It was intentional policy. The belief behind it was simple. If the workhouse served hearty meals, poor families might see it as a safety net rather than a last resort. To prevent this supposed moral collapse, administrators ensured that every meal communicated one consistent message. You're here because you ran out of options, and this is what running out of options tastes like. Winter made these diets even more significant. The cold increased caloric needs, yet workhouse inmates were not granted extra portions. A labourer outside might try to eat more during the season, more bread, more potatoes, more fat, because their body demanded it. But the inmate's diet did not budge, no matter how biting the wind or how long the nights. Workhouses served the same rations in January that they served in June, as if human metabolism politely ignored frost. And of course, inmates couldn't supplement their meals. They couldn't forage, earn extra money or trade with neighbours. They certainly couldn't request more food. Asking for seconds in a 19th century workhouse would have been treated with the suspicion normally reserved for organised rebellion. It wasn't only the quantity that was controlled, it was the experience. Meals were served at strict times, eaten in silence, and consumed quickly. Dining rooms were not designed for comfort or conversation. They were built to move bodies in and out efficiently. Hunger was supposed to discipline, not distract. Eating was treated less like a human need and more like an administrative procedure. Children fared slightly better than adults, but not by much. Their diets sometimes included small allowances of milk or extra bread, but these additions were modest. Orphans, in particular, they lived under the constant gaze of boards of guardians who believed that overfeeding the poor was the first step towards societal collapse. The irony, if you squinted and tilted your head, was that food in the workhouse was safer and more regular than food outside during winter. The poorest labourers might go days with little beyond a crust of bread or a boiled potato. Inside the workhouse, at least the schedule didn't falter. Breakfast would appear, lunch would arrive, dinner would follow. Predictability, not pleasure, was the system's main achievement. Yet even this predictability came with emotional cost. Inmates understood the symbolism of their meals. Serving sizes reinforced their dependence. The blandness reminded them of lost autonomy. The regimentation erased the small joys that mealtimes usually provide. Talking, tasting, choosing, at least savouring. In a sense, the food wasn't meant to feed the body so much as it was meant to shape the spirit. Superintendents recorded consumption obsessively. Accounting books listed not just how many loaves were bought, but how many ounces were issued per person per day. Dietaries were scrutinised not for nutritional adequacy, but for fiscal efficiency. Food was a number, not a necessity. For many inmates, the greatest indignity was not the portion size or the monotony. It was the knowledge that the food was intentionally engineered to be just barely enough. You weren't meant to thrive, you were meant to persist. There is a difference, and winter made that difference sting sharply. Which brings us to the chapter's humour, a bleak little truth dressed up as a joke. Food didn't nourish you. It proved a point. To understand winter in 19th century London, you must stop thinking of the cold as a meteorological event and start thinking of it as an economic one. Frost didn't simply freeze puddles and redden noses, it froze livelihoods, froze wages, froze the fragile stability that working families spent all year trying to build. Winter was, in every sense, a financial season. And nowhere is this more visible than in the bustling, desperate, highly adaptive winter relief economy that emerged across the city. Start with the numbers, because numbers reveal the scale of the struggle. In 1848, London spent £725,000 on relief for the poor, a staggering amount for the era. Adjusted for modern purchasing power, it's roughly equivalent to £112 million, and that was just one winter's accounting. These weren't optional benevolent gestures. These were emergency injections of funds into a city that simply did not function the same way once temperatures dropped. Why so much spending? Because winter exposed every fault line in the economic system. Seasonal labourers lost work, food prices climbed, fuel costs surged, illness flattened households, and when wages evaporated, so did people's ability to buy the essentials of survival. London needed a winter safety net, and so it improvised one, messy, fragile and deeply revealing. Soup kitchens sprang up first, run by parishes, charities, philanthropists and sometimes concerned private citizens. They offered the most basic form of relief, hot food. Not generous food, mind you, usually broth, bread or gruel, but warm food, which was enough to keep thousands from collapsing on the frost-hardened pavements. Yeah, long lines formed outside temporary kitchens built in alleys, courtyards and churchyards. Poor families queued for hours, bowls in hand, wrapped in threadbare layers that did more for modesty than for warmth. Charitable groups multiplied in winter like seasonal pop-ups. Religious societies distributed blankets, boots and coal tickets. Wealthy benefactors hosted fundraisers where attendees congratulated one another on their generosity, while remaining far from the neighbourhoods actually receiving aid. Some charities offered visiting relief, sending inspectors into people's homes to determine whether they deserved help. Nothing warms the heart like a cold weather inspection to decide if your suffering is authentic enough. Yet even with charitable support, most Londoners relied on a far older institution, the pawn shop, where pawnbrokers thrived in winter with an enthusiasm that bordered on festive. Their shops glowed warm and bright, luring the cold and desperate with promises of instant cash. Belongings became currency, objects became lifelines, and winter dictated which possessions would be sacrificed first. Coats went early, coats were valuable, portable, and easy to pawn, which created a miserable irony. You pawn the garment that keeps you warm to raise money for the fuel that will keep you warm. Blankets followed, then boots, then good shirts, then tools. Anything that could survive a few months away and be reclaimed once wages returned in spring. The winter pawning cycle was so common that pawnbrokers scheduled their ledgers around it, knowing they'd see the same names, the same items, and the same exhausted families year after year. Pawning wasn't shameful, it was expected. It was the informal extension of the relief system, the private sector response to a public seasonal crisis. The pawn ticket became a small paper contract between survival today and hope for tomorrow. Families lived on these tickets, exchanging them for food, fuel, medicine, and occasionally even rent. Other businesses boomed too. Chimney sweeps saw increased demand. So did sellers of second-hand clothing, used furniture, and broken coal. Yes, broken coal. Coal merchants often collected the fragments that fell during deliveries and sold them cheaply in separate bags. Poor families bought these scraps gratefully. Warmth didn't need to come in elegant chunks. Even the city's street economy changed. Match sellers became more visible. Firewood hawkers roamed alleys with carts of thin, fast-burning branches. Coal porters worked long hours delivering sacks to wealthier homes, and those who were too weak or too ill to work shifted to begging, relying on the generosity of passers-by, who themselves were often one unlucky week away from joining the same crowd. The winter relief economy was not merely about money, it was about movement. Belongings moved to pawn shops. Charitable goods moved to the needy. Coins moved into the hands of shopkeepers, landlords, and coal merchants. And people moved constantly, searching for work, seeking help, visiting soup kitchens, taking items to pawn, retrieving food or coal vouchers, queuing for public assistance, or walking the streets hoping to find any opportunity at all. Winter also strained relationships within households. Families negotiated which possessions to pawn first. A beloved heirloom might stay a little longer than a new coat, but sentimentality had limits. Children's shoes were often spared until the very end. Walking barefoot on frozen cobblestones was devastating. Adults sacrificed their own items first. Many mothers quietly pawned wedding rings, saving their children from knowing how desperate things had become. No one experienced winter relief alone. Tenants pleaded with landlords for extensions. Neighbours lent coins, blankets, or leftover fuel. Local priests organised collections. Charities distributed coal tickets redeemable at designated merchants. And yet, through all these networks, the underlying truth remained. London survived winter each year not because it was prepared, but because everyone collectively scrambled not to let catastrophe spread too far. This seasonal upheaval shaped the city's character. It created rhythms of hardship and generosity, desperation and innovation. It exposed the fragility of working-class life, but also the adaptability that made survival possible. Because in winter, even your own possessions weren't permanent. They were negotiable assets in a personal economy run on necessity, sacrifice and strategic pawning. Or, as Londoners might have put it, winter turned belongings into temporary income. Winter in 1800s, Europe didn't just inconvenience travel, it rewrote the map. Roads became unusable, paths vanished under snowdrifts, and muddy tracks froze into obstacles rather than routes. But winter, in its relentlessly dramatic fashion, didn't stop there. It also created new highways, unofficial, temporary and extremely cold ones. When temperatures plummeted long enough, rivers stopped flowing and became solid ice, transforming into wide, glittering boulevards that no engineer had planned and no government had budgeted for. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was a documented historical reality. In 1831, James Sweeney described winters in which the Danube, Elbe and Seine froze with such immovable solidity that wagons, full-sized, heavy, horse-drawn wagons, crossed them safely. Imagine the astonishment of watching your region's most powerful river, normally a roaring artery of trade, turn into a frozen platform so stable that merchants shrugged and said, "Well, I suppose this is the road now." Rivers became roads not by human intention, but by meteorological force. Throughout Central and Western Europe, prolonged hard frost could lock waterways into icy highways for weeks at a time. Towns that were normally connected by bridges suddenly found themselves linked by enormous frozen plains. Travellers who usually paid tolls to cross river bridges simply stepped onto the ice and walked, rode, or carted their goods across for free, one of winter's rare gifts, though it came wrapped in danger. When the Danube froze, it became a spectacle. On such occasions, locals and foreign visitors described vast stretches of ice dotted with pedestrians, animals, sleighs and wagons. Temporary markets sprang up on the surface, an icy version of pop-up street fairs. Children skated where ships once sailed. Sailors, suddenly unemployed by the stillness of the water, helped guide carts across safe routes, or warned travellers away from suspiciously thin patches. Entire communities reshaped their routines around the river's unexpected new function. The Elbe, normally a powerful shipping route, became a frozen thoroughfare linking towns in unusual and efficient ways. People who typically avoided crossing the river due to cost or inconvenience suddenly found themselves taking shortcuts across its icy expanse. Barges, stranded and immovable, sat like frozen relics trapped mid-journey. Fishermen drilled holes into the ice, turning transportation routes into fishing grounds. But the most astonishing feature was the wagon traffic, merchants driving loaded carts across ice, thick enough to support both horse and cargo. The Seine, running through France and touching the heart of Paris, also froze during extreme winters. When it did, Parisians spilled onto its surface with a mix of excitement and alarm. The bridges, normally crowded, became secondary to the novelty of the frozen river itself. Temporary stalls appeared selling food, drink and trinkets. Bold souls attempted winter sports long before they had official names. The Seine froze rarely and never without controversy, because river ice in a major city meant both opportunity and disruption. These icy highways weren't harmless miracles, though. They were infrastructure born of hypothermia, beautiful but treacherous. People misjudged the stability of the ice. Cracks opened without warning. Horses could panic, shattering weak spots. Wagons sometimes broke through and vanished beneath the surface, their loss as swift as it was irreversible. Communities stationed watchers along the ice to warn others of unstable sections. It was part road, part hazard, part seasonal temptation. Still, when conditions were right, the frozen rivers helped maintain winter economies. Merchants could continue moving goods when normal roads became impassable. Farmers transported produce or supplies across short, flat, icy paths that bypassed the twisting, snow-choked roads inland. Postal services adapted, occasionally sending messengers over river ice when overland routes failed. Winter closed doors, but frozen rivers opened new ones. There was also the social side. A frozen river provided entertainment in a season otherwise defined by hardship. People carved patterns on the ice, played games, raced, skated, or performed daring stunts. Artists painted river-freezing scenes, viewing them as emblematic of nature's dramatic transformations. Farmers and villagers held outdoor gatherings, and turning the temporarily solid river into a communal space unlike anything seen during the rest of the year. But the frozen rivers also reminded people of winter's power and its unpredictability. The ice could hold wagon traffic one day and crack the next. Thaws began invisibly from below, weakening the ice without outward sign. Travellers had to listen for specific sounds. A dull groan beneath the surface, a sharp crack echoing upstream, a subtle vibration that warned of danger. Crossing the river required not only courage but a deep local understanding of the river's moods. No two freezes were alike, and winter offered no guarantees. For governments and administrators, frozen rivers were a mixed blessing. They knew they couldn't endorse the practice officially, it was too risky. But they also knew they couldn't prevent people from using the ice when it promised speed, savings, or survival. So winter policy often amounted to proceed at your own risk, paired with the unspoken acknowledgement that everyone would proceed anyway. The frozen rivers also revealed an important truth about 19th century winter life. People adapted instantly to whatever the season offered, no matter how extreme. If winter shut down roads, communities carved new ones out of solid ice. If bridges became slippery and dangerous, townsfolk simply stepped down onto the river itself. If nature itself provided infrastructure, people used it. And yet, beneath all this resilience and ingenuity, one cannot help but marvel at the absurdity of it. When your river freezes solid enough to support heavy transportation, it may solve a logistical problem, but it also indicates weather conditions so severe that survival demands improvisation on a scale bordering on the heroic. In other words, infrastructure arrived courtesy of hypothermia. If winter had a flair for the dramatic, then the winter of 1813 to 1814 was its masterpiece. For centuries, the River Thames had frozen often enough to host festivities, markets, and the occasional questionable stunt. But by the early 19th century, engineering improvements to the river's embankments and the removal of old bridge structures made freezing far less likely. So when the Thames suddenly transformed into a solid sheet of ice at the end of 1813, Londoners reacted with a mixture of awe, excitement, and entrepreneurial enthusiasm, the kind that only appears when nature hands you an unexpected marketplace. The freeze began in late December 1813 and stretched brutally into January 1814, with temperatures plummeting night after night. The cold was relentless. Ice thickened by inches. Boats lay stranded and unmoving. The river surface turned opaque, white, and slowly, unmistakably walkable. At first, only a few brave or foolish souls stepped onto the frozen riverbanks. Then more followed. Then, inevitably, London decided, well, if the river is solid, we might as well throw a festival on it. Thus emerged the Last Frost Fair, a spontaneous winter carnival held from February 1st to 5th, 1814, and destined to become the final and most famous event of its kind. Within hours of the fair's unofficial opening, the ice transformed into a bustling, chaotic, and thoroughly British street scene, except the street was a frozen river, and the possibility of sudden death was part of the ambience. Booths sprang up seemingly overnight, wooden stalls, makeshift tents, canvas-covered counters, all anchored precariously onto the ice using ropes, stakes, or, optimistically, sheer confidence. Vendors sold everything imaginable: food, drink, trinkets, printed souvenirs, and even questionable artistic keepsakes claiming to commemorate the historic freeze. Some Londoners, sensing opportunity, lugged roasting equipment onto the ice. Fires burned in iron pans or raised hearths, because what could possibly go wrong with setting open flames directly on a frozen river? Crowds loved it. The scent of sizzling meat drifted through the frosty air, drawing customers like moths to a barbecue held on the world's most dangerous patio. Games appeared too. People skated, danced, raced, and chiselled patterns into the frost. Temporary taverns served gin and ale to customers delighted by the novelty of drinking on the Thames rather than beside it. Artists set up easels. Photographers didn't exist yet, but printmakers did, and they printed thousands of souvenir cards proclaiming the glorious Frost Fair of 1814. Every fairgoer seemed determined not only to attend, but to purchase a reminder that they had stood on a natural wonder that might never happen again. And indeed, it never did. The atmosphere was electric, joy mixed with spectacle, celebration mixed with disbelief. Ordinary life in London was difficult at the best of times. Winter made everything harsher. But this frozen river created a pocket of shared delight in a season normally dominated by worry. People from different classes mingled freely, wandering between stalls, examining curiosities, and marvelling at the world turned suddenly upside down. Yet beneath the merriment lurked danger. The ice varied in thickness from place to place, and crowds tended to gather where the attractions were densest, putting strain on certain areas. The weight of booths, fires, animals, and hundreds of Londoners parading about was precarious. The river groaned. Cracks spidered through the surface. Ominous sounds drifted beneath the festivities like background percussion. Still, the fair continued. After all, how often does a river freeze solid enough to walk across? Londoners understood risk. They simply chose to ignore it while eating roasted mutton on ice. But the river had its own schedule. On February 5th, temperatures rose. The freeze began to weaken. Vendors shuttered their stalls. Visitors thinned. Those who remained soon realised the Thames was preparing its final dramatic act. As the ice broke apart, entire sections cracked and separated with terrifying speed. Some stalls collapsed into frigid water. People scrambled to solid ground. A few fell through the ice and drowned, victims of winter's last unforgiving gesture. When the thaw was complete, the Thames resumed its flow, washing away the debris of the frost fair, tables, signs, splintered wood, ash from extinguished fires, lost shoes, dropped coins, abandoned mugs. Londoners carried the memory with them, but the river left no trace. And as the 19th century progressed, changes to the London Bridge, embankments, and water flow made it nearly impossible for the Thames to freeze so completely again. This made the 1814 Frost Fair both a spectacle and a historical finale, the last time Londoners would stroll across the river as if it were a city street. Later generations would read about it in newspapers and diaries, marvelling at the strangeness of a world in which carnivals formed on ice and vendors considered the middle of a river a perfectly acceptable commercial venue. What truly captures the spirit of the fair is the unshakable entrepreneurial instinct it revealed. The moment winter handed London a frozen surface, people did what they always do. They set up shop. Because in 19th century London the rule was simple. If nature gave you a platform, even a fragile, melting, unpredictable one, someone would sell souvenirs on it. Or in the humour of the era, if the river froze, people sold souvenirs. The winter of 1829 to 1830 did not simply arrive in Central Europe. It declared dominion, wrapped the region in a glacial fist, and informed every river, road, town, and unfortunate human being that normal life had been suspended until further notice. Modern meteorologists studying the season classify it as one of the most severe winters of the 19th century, but people living through it didn't need scientific confirmation. They watched their landscapes freeze so completely that daily existence felt less like winter and more like an extended act of atmospheric imprisonment. The cold hit early and hit hard. Temperatures dropped and refused to rise, locking the region into a deep freeze that lasted week after agonizing week. Rivers, those vital arteries of commerce and transportation, became wide, icy slabs stretching across Central Europe. The freeze was not decorative, it was absolute. The waterways stiffened into white highways, reducing shipping routes to nothing and silencing harbours that normally pulsed with trade. Barges, rafts and ferries sat trapped midstream like insects caught in amber. Only the ice moved, cracking, shifting, groaning under its own vastness. Transport collapsed almost immediately. Overland travel was difficult enough in ordinary winters, with muddy roads turning solid and rutted. But the winter of 1829-30 made movement nearly impossible. Snow piled on roads, blocking passage entirely. Carriages overturned on treacherous surfaces. Horses sank into drifts deeper than their own chests. Roads that connected cities became useless white corridors leading nowhere. Farmers could not reach markets. Traders could not reach customers. Messengers could not reach anybody. Central Europe froze not just physically but economically. With rivers inaccessible and roads immobilized, entire regions became isolated. Villages went weeks without receiving goods. Towns rationed food with grim discipline. In some places, authorities tried to organize emergency sled caravans over the snow, but the cold was so severe that the runners cracked, horses went lame, and provisions froze solid before reaching their destinations. Communities huddled indoors, waiting for news that never came, because winter refused to allow even information to travel. And yet, in a twist only nature could produce, the real catastrophe began after the cold finally loosened its grip. When the first hints of thaw appeared in early spring, relief washed through the region. People opened shutters long sealed against the cold. Rivers showed patches of dark water beneath their ice armour. Birds returned hesitantly. But beneath the fragile warmth lurked disaster. Every winter freeze stores potential energy. Every frozen river conceals a future problem. In 1830, that problem arrived with the sudden fury of nature exacting overdue revenge. As the ice began to melt, solid sheets softened unevenly. Blocks broke apart in chunks the size of barns. These enormous fragments didn't melt peacefully. They moved, collection after collection of jagged, shifting ice masses rushing downstream. Bridges shuddered, embankments trembled. Entire sections of river broke loose, of forming ice jams that acted like temporary dams. Water built behind them with tremendous pressure, and then the dams failed. The resulting catastrophic floods swept through low-lying regions of Central Europe. Towns awoke to find streets turned into rivers, fields vanished under surges of icy water. Mills, homes and warehouses were torn apart by the force of debris-laden currents. Some communities that had endured the freezing months with stoic resilience suddenly found themselves climbing onto rooftops as water roared past their doors. Flood studies of this event emphasize how destructive the sequence was. Extreme freeze to rapid thaw to ice jam flooding. Each stage was dependent on the one before it. The very cold that immobilized cities for months also primed the landscape for devastation. Winter locked Europe in place, as spring broke it apart. Beyond the physical destruction, the thaw presented logistical nightmares. Bridges collapsed under ice impacts, severing essential travel routes. Roads that had only just re-emerged from snowdrifts turned into mud pits. Entire supply chains needed rebuilding. Regional authorities scrambled to coordinate rebuilding efforts, while still coping with the economic paralysis caused by winter's length. But even in this misery, human responses varied from ingenious to desperate. Communities lashed boats together to create makeshift bridges. Mill workers used poles to guide ice chunks away from vulnerable structures. Families carried valuables to attics or hilltops. Some people navigated flooded streets using barrels or wooden doors as rafts. It was in every sense a season that required creativity, not for art, but for survival. And once the chaos settled, Europe was left with a collective memory of a winter that felt like a trial, followed by a spring that felt like a lawsuit. Winter had frozen the continent with incredible thoroughness, But spring delivered the bill, waterlogged, destructive, and impossible to contest. This dual disaster became part of regional lore. Older generations recalled it with the tone usually reserved for mythology, the season when everything froze and the season when everything broke. It shaped perceptions of winter for decades. It reshaped infrastructural planning in many towns. It revealed the vulnerabilities of river-dependent economies. And it stood as a reminder that winter's effects didn't end when the ice melted. They often began. Because if winter in 1829-30 immobilized Europe with its severity, and spring completed the devastation by unleashing everything that winter had carefully stored. Put another way, winter froze Europe, spring sued it for damages. Winter in 19th century Europe had a talent for creating misery in layers. It didn't just freeze homes, shut down transport, or sicken entire families. It reached backward in time and sabotaged the year's harvest, ensuring that when the cold finally arrived, it found households already weakened, anxious, and short on options. Winter didn't just consume resources, it exposed every agricultural failure of the previous seasons, turning a bad harvest into a catastrophe and a mediocre harvest into a crisis. To understand this dynamic, imagine Europe's food system as an interconnected chain held together by fragile links. Farmers grew crops, markets distributed them, and merchants transported them, and families rationed them. Winter snapped multiple links at once. The first break came when crop failures, caused by droughts, blight, storms, or unseasonably early frosts, reduced the amount of food stored for winter in the first place. Rural families grew the majority of their annual supply in just a few short months. A bad summer wasn't inconvenient. It was terrifying. It meant heading into winter with storage bins that looked far emptier than they should. Urban families were even more vulnerable because they didn't produce food, they purchased it. And in cities, shortages revealed themselves rapidly. When crop yields dipped, the price of staples rose. Even modest increases could devastate the working poor, whose wages barely stretched across basic necessities. And bread, the backbone of diets across Europe, became the first product people watched nervously. A small increase in grain prices could mean fewer meals each week. A significant spike could mean hunger setting in before winter even fully arrived. But winter wasn't finished. The second break came when transportation froze. Roads became impassable, rivers sealed under ice, and shipping routes halted. Merchants could no longer bring in grain from regions with better harvests. Local markets were cut off, isolated, and left to compete over whatever limited supply existed. Imports stopped not because they weren't available, but because winter physically blocked them from reaching the people who needed them. This wasn't just a rural problem, it was an urban disaster. Cities were hungry engines that required daily inflows of food. Without steady transport, prices surged with ruthless speed. Bakers stood in awe and horror as the cost of flour rose week after week. Market traders reduced the size of their loaves or increased their prices, sometimes both. Families who once bought bread daily now made one loaf stretch over several days. People invented new recipes that were less creative cuisine, and more things we can chew to trick our stomachs. Europeans at the time described hunger not as a sudden emergency, but as a slow tightening, a creeping pressure that grew harsher with each cold day. Winter didn't knock down doors, it seeped in, quiet and patient. As grain prices rose, the cost of every other food followed. Potatoes, oats, barley, cabbage, and onions all tightened in supply. Meat, already a luxury for the poor, became virtually unobtainable. Milk production dropped as animals struggled to survive the cold. Fresh produce vanished, replaced by storage crops that dwindled dangerously as the season progressed. Urban hunger swelled. Municipal authorities attempted to intervene. Some opened municipal granaries, others purchased grain reserves or subsidized bread. But these efforts varied wildly in effectiveness. A small town might succeed in moderating prices, while a major industrial city could do little but watch tensions rise. Winter hunger wasn't clean. It didn't hit everyone the same way. The poorest starved quietly first. Households with slightly more money reduced meal sizes or began watering down stews. Children were given the most substantial portions. Adults scraped pots clean. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts one day and vanished the next when their supplies ran out. Families lined up outside markets before dawn, hoping to buy a few handfuls of grain at prices they could still afford. The crisis worsened when livestock suffered. Animals struggled to find fodder, particularly when snow-covered grazing lands or stored feed spoiled. With weak animals producing less milk, hauling less weight, and sometimes dying outright, the food chain weakened further. Poor families lost both nourishment and labour support. Farmers lost their herds. Cities lost their supply lines. Winter didn't need to attack people directly. It attacked their animals. In regions heavily dependent on grain imports, hunger took on a sharper edge. Countries or provinces that usually relied on river barges found their supply chains severed for weeks or months. A rural area might survive on stored crops, but a city cut off from its hinterland was stranded. Hunger illuminated the structural vulnerabilities of early industrial Europe. Cities had grown faster than their ability to feed themselves, but even hunger had its own economy. People traded labour for leftover scraps. Bakers sold yesterday's bread for slightly less than today's inflated loaves. Families pawned possessions to buy food, items that would have been unthinkable to sacrifice in luckier seasons. Winter rearranged priorities with brutal clarity. Heirlooms became negotiable, meals became victories. In some cases, local governments attempted price controls. These worked only as long as merchants cooperated, and merchants did not always cooperate. A black market emerged wherever hunger did. Traders might hide grain to drive prices higher, or smuggle it in secret to wealthier customers who could pay more. Hunger made markets predatory. Urban poverty deepened as people wandered streets in search of work that simply didn't exist in winter. Those who earned by the day found themselves choosing between fuel and bread, and often losing both battles. And through it all, winter maintained its polite indifference. Snow fell, temperatures dropped, and hunger tightened its grip one quiet hour at a time. Because in the 1800s, famine didn't need dramatic thunderclaps or apocalyptic storms. It needed only two ingredients, a bad harvest and a long winter. Or, to phrase it the way hunger might, if it had a sense of humour, hunger didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in wearing snow. Winter in 19th century Europe was always ruthless. But in Finland between 1866 and 1868, it became something far darker, an event that pushed a nation beyond hardship and into catastrophe. These years are remembered as the Great Hunger Years, a famine so severe that in some regions up to 40% of the population died, and nationwide losses reached approximately 150,000 people, nearly 8% of Finland's total population at the time. It was not a single failure or a single winter that caused it. It was the perfect storm of consecutive bad harvests, brutal cold, disease, political strain, and a society that simply didn't have the safety nets to survive two disastrous winters in a row. To understand how winter shaped this tragedy, we have to begin with the harvest of 1866, or rather, the lack of one. Summer rains had drowned crops, delaying growth and encouraging mildew. Fields that usually produced rye, the backbone of the Finnish diet, yielded almost nothing. Potatoes rotted, barley failed. The food that was supposed to carry people through winter simply didn't exist. It wasn't a shortage, it was a void. Then winter arrived early. By late autumn 1866, the ground froze hard. Lakes iced over, snow-blanketed villages before families had time to gather even the meagre remnants of their ruined fields. Where a normal winter might have strained resources, this one crushed them outright. Food stores that should have lasted months ran empty in weeks. Families who normally weathered winter by carefully rationing suddenly realized they had nothing to ration. And when the ice locked the countryside shut, Finland became a trap. Roads disappeared under drifts, transport stalled. Importing grain became nearly impossible. Finland, then a Grand Duchy under the Russian Empire, depended on local harvests far more than Western Europe did. When those harvests failed, there was no international market large or flexible enough to compensate quickly. Winter didn't merely block food, it prevented the nation from asking for help in time. By early 1867, people were starving. Villagers ate bark, lichen, straw, and ground-up pine bark, mixed into makeshift famine bread that was so fibrous it damaged the digestive tract. Some resorted to heating leather and scraping off the softened scraps. Hunger pushed families to wander from parish to parish, searching for relief. They walked through snowstorms for days, only to find that each new village was just as desperate as the last. Relief centres were overwhelmed. Workhouses collapsed under the burden. Local clergy wrote letters begging the government for grain shipments that had been delayed by weather, frozen ports, or bureaucratic hesitation. Then spring arrived, but without mercy. The thaw of 1867 brought floods, which destroyed what little seed grain remained. The summer that followed was cruelly cold. Frosts in August killed young crops before they ripened. Farmers watched their fields fail for the second year in a row, knowing exactly what the next winter would bring. 12 months of starvation had already hollowed communities. Now winter was coming again with nothing to hold it back. Famine deepened, mortality skyrocketed, entire villages nearly vanished. But winter had yet another card to play: disease. Starvation weakens immune systems, and weakened bodies cannot fight infection. A typhus swept through Finland with blistering speed. Dysentery followed. People gathered in overcrowded relief centres, coughing and shivering in unheated rooms, where disease spread like fire. Those who travelled in search of help carried sickness with them from region to region. In the spring thaw of 1868, cholera struck, finishing what hunger had begun. Modern historians are careful to note that the famine was not caused by winter alone. Policy failures, rigid social structures, and slow governmental response all contributed. But winter was the force that magnified every human error. Winter froze transport when grain was needed most. Winter destroyed crops left vulnerable from summer rains. Winter drove malnourished people into crowded spaces where illness thrived. Winter turned poverty into death. In some regions suffered beyond imagination. In parts of northern and eastern Finland, mortality approached 40%, numbers normally associated with pandemics or war. Entire hamlets lost half their residents. School teachers recorded empty desks with bleak resignation. Priests kept death registers that read like community obituaries. Survivors later described winters where silence hung over their villages because so few remained to break it. And yet, even in the midst of catastrophe, people tried to endure. Families shared what scraps they had. Villagers organised communal soup lines. Children were sent to live with relatives in less affected areas. Clergymen walked from house to house distributing small amounts of grain. But good intentions could not feed thousands when the national supply had already evaporated. By late 1868, relief finally arrived. Grain shipments reached ports, harvests marginally improved, and disease waned. The famine ended, leaving behind a country forever changed. Finland reformed its relief systems, invested in grain reserves, and slowly rebuilt. But the psychological imprint lasted generations. The Hunger Years became a defining national memory, referenced in stories, songs, and family histories long after the snow melted. The tragedy of 1866 to 1868 wasn't that winter tested Finland. It's that 2 winters in a row tested it harder than any nation could withstand. Winter didn't merely challenge survival, it dismantled it. It turned scarcity into crisis, and crisis into catastrophe. What should have been a difficult season became a demographic disaster. Because in this chapter of European history, winter was not a backdrop or a seasonal inconvenience. Winter was the architect of loss. Or, as the humour of this grim era might put it, winter didn't just test survival, it erased it. Winter in 19th century Sweden was never a polite visitor, but during the famine years of the 1860s, it became something closer to a bureaucratic prankster, a season that exposed every weakness in the nation's relief system and then amplified it for good measure. Few regions illustrate this better than Västerbotten, a northern province where the cold was severe, the distances vast and the stakes unforgiving. Here, winter wasn't just weather. It was a logistical force that decided whether food would arrive or whether entire communities would simply starve while officials filled out paperwork. Sweden, like Finland, faced a devastating agricultural crisis in 1867 to 1868, and the government attempted to respond with large-scale grain relief shipments. On paper, the numbers seemed impressive. Västerbotten alone was allocated 147,676 barrels of grain for its population of fewer than 90,000 people. If those barrels had magically appeared in every village, Finland's northern neighbour might have escaped the worst of the famine. But winter had other ideas. Grain does not teleport, it travels. And in Västerbotten, travel meant traversing hundreds of kilometres of icy rivers, snow-choked roads, frozen forests, and sparsely populated wilderness. Even in ideal conditions, it was hard to move freight across northern Sweden. In famine conditions, when urgency was high, snow was deep, and temperatures dropped low enough to freeze wagon axles, it became a nightmare. Swedish officials planned the relief effort meticulously on paper. They created distribution routes, assigned delivery quotas, issued official orders, and scheduled shipment timetables. The problem was that paper plans did not acknowledge the reality of Swedish winter. Reports travelled swiftly along telegraph lines. Grain did not. Bureaucratic correspondence moved from Stockholm to regional offices at a perfectly respectable pace. Food crawled behind it like a frozen afterthought. This disconnect became fatal. Grain shipments moving north were repeatedly delayed by ice-blocked waterways, impassable cart tracks, and blizzards that shut down movement for days or even weeks. Caravans were forced to turn back. Sledges overturned. Horses perished. In some cases, barrels arrived partially frozen or damaged, the food inside spoiled beyond use. And every delay tightened the noose on communities already living at the edge of starvation. The Swedish government tried to adapt. They redirected shipments to coastal ports, only to discover that winter had frozen those too. They attempted inland routes, but snowdrifts swallowed wagons like pits. They issued new instructions, at length, and with impeccable penmanship. But instructions do not feed people. Villagers waited for relief with dwindling hope, staring down roads where no sledges appeared, no matter how many times someone claimed they were on their way. Meanwhile, a bitter controversy simmered in the background. Sweden continued to export grain even as famine ravaged its northern regions. The southern provinces, with comparatively better harvests and stronger commercial ties, maintained export contracts with foreign markets. To cancel these would have disrupted Sweden's reputation and income, so grain left the country while starving Swedes prayed for food to arrive from Stockholm. The symbolism was inescapable. Grain was flowing out of Sweden faster than it moved within Sweden. Local newspapers and clergy protested. Regional governors pleaded with the central government for more decisive intervention. Communities accused officials of valuing paperwork over people. And while the debate escalated, the famine deepened. The Västerbotten shipments became a case study in logistical fragility. Grain was available. Grain was allocated. Grain was promised. But grain did not arrive in time. The landscape itself acted like a bureaucratic filter, slowing everything down, refusing to allow efficiency, and punishing any assumption that southern planning could easily translate into northern execution. Relief stations, set up to distribute food once it arrived, faced their own challenges. Some received too much grain at once and lacked storage. Others received none for weeks. A few received deliveries so late that the famine had already claimed the people they were meant to help. Winter's timing was cruel. It ensured that miscalculations became tragedies rather than inconveniences. At the village level, survival strategies grew grim. Families wandered toward coastal towns, hoping that grain shipments might land there first. Parents sent children to wealthier relatives far to the south. Villagers broke apart furniture to trade for food in local markets that were themselves running out of stock. As sickness spread through malnourished communities, and with medical resources thin, the death toll climbed. Swedish officials kept meticulous records. They documented quantities shipped, barrels allocated, deliveries processed, and letters exchanged. They tracked everything except whether the system actually worked in real time for the people who needed it most. And this is where the historical tragedy reveals its bitter humour. The paperwork often travelled faster than the grain it described. There is an almost tragic theatricality to the image of a starving village receiving a letter, assuring them that relief shipments were scheduled, processed, documented, approved, and en route, while the wagon carrying the food sat immobilised in a snowdrift halfway across the province. When the famine finally broke in 1868, it was due less to logistical triumph than to the arrival of spring and a desperately needed improvement in the harvest. The Swedish government made reforms in the years that followed, strengthening relief systems, rethinking transportation infrastructure, and building greater grain reserves. But the memory of those winters lingered. Västerbotten in particular remembered how close the region had come to catastrophe, not because grain didn't exist, but because winter made sure it couldn't reach the people who desperately needed it. Sweden's famine history is often overshadowed by Finland's more devastating losses, but the lesson is the same. Winter doesn't just test food systems, it tests everything: infrastructure, bureaucracy, political will, and human endurance. And in 1860s Sweden, winter proved that even the best planned relief effort can collapse when the season itself refuses to cooperate. Put another way, paperwork travelled faster than food. Some winters arrive suddenly, others arrive impolitely. But the winter of 1879 to 1880 did something far more dramatic. It arrived, sat down comfortably, and refused to leave. Europe remembers it not because it produced the single coldest day on record, but because it produced a relentless, unbroken season of cold, a slow-moving meteorological siege that stretched from autumn into spring like a glacier sliding across the calendar. Modern climate historians and meteorologists still study the winter of 1879 to 80 because of its unusual persistence. It wasn't defined by a single catastrophic storm or a brief plunge in temperature. Instead, it delivered sustained cold across Western and Central Europe, month after unforgiving month, with barely a thaw to break the monotony. It was winter as an occupation force, setting up camp in November and only reluctantly releasing its grip sometime in April. The trouble began early. November 1879 arrived with temperatures already several degrees below average. Frost gripped the ground before many towns had stored their winter supplies. Rivers crusted over prematurely. Farmers, expecting a few more weeks of workable weather, were caught off guard when the cold hardened the soil, early enough to ruin late-root harvests. This meant families began the winter with less food and more anxiety than usual. December brought no relief, and temperature records from the period show ice days, days where the temperature never rose above freezing, stacking up like dominoes. In England, France, the Low Countries and Germany, frost settled into a routine. Mornings began below freezing, afternoons stayed below freezing, and nights dipped into punishing cold. People became accustomed to waking up to frost glazing their bed linens and the sound of ice cracking in their wash basins. By January 1880, even newspapers accustomed to sensational winter reporting began using language that bordered on alarm. Reports described frozen canals in the Netherlands so solid that entire communities travelled by skates for weeks at a time. In Paris, fountains froze entirely, not just the surface but the water deep inside, creating enormous ice sculptures that became accidental attractions. and coal consumption soared, and coal shortages followed, leaving poorer families to burn whatever they could find. Meanwhile, the wealthy complained that their conservatories, those prideful display rooms for tropical plants, were losing battles against frost even with constant heating. For the working poor, the prolonged cold created a perfect storm of hardship. Seasonal labourers were out of work not for weeks but for months. Cost of living soared, fuel prices climbed, food prices followed, charities and municipal relief systems strained under demand. The cold didn't come in catastrophic waves. It came in a quiet, grinding continuity that prevented people from recovering between bouts of hardship. Rivers continued freezing deeper. The Rhine, Seine, Thames and numerous canals became thick ice lanes for far longer than usual. Even major ports saw ice formations that interfered with shipping. In Belgium, coal shipments stalled when barges were immobilised. In Germany, steamers remained tied to docks while labourers attempted to break river ice manually, a task that looked heroic but changed very little. January did offer a handful of mild days, but the thaw was short-lived. February brought cold that was somehow both predictable and emotionally exhausting. People were not surprised when frost coated their window panes each morning. They were surprised when it didn't. This prolonged winter created cascading economic consequences. Livestock struggled to survive months of inadequate grazing and bitter winds. Frozen roads disrupted trade routes. Factories relying on water power found their wheels frozen in place. Textile mills across the Low Countries and Germany reported reduced output. Cities burned more fuel than expected, draining municipal budgets and leading to emergency appropriations at winter's end. And yet, historically speaking, the winter's severity is not defined by drama but by duration. Unlike flash freezes or single devastating storms, the winter of 1879-80 earned its place in climate research because it allowed scientists to study how ecosystems respond to prolonged cold stress. Tree ring analyses from across Europe show narrow growth bands corresponding to this season. Contemporary climate studies use this winter as a benchmark for understanding long-lasting atmospheric blocking patterns, periods when the jet stream stalls and keeps cold air parked over one region for months. The psychological impact was just as significant. Diaries from the period mention the emotional fatigue of a winter with no end in sight. One London woman described the season as a cold that lives in the bones and refuses eviction. A Belgian shopkeeper wrote that he had stopped checking the weather because the forecast has been the same for a month. Today again, winter. Families rationed food with unusual strictness because they feared, correctly, that spring might be delayed, and delayed it was. March 1880 came with temperatures still stubbornly low. Snowstorms struck regions that typically saw flowers by March. Early April brought more frost, damaging the first tentative sprouts of spring crops. Farmers spoke of the year without early spring, a phrase that echoed previous disasters, though the agricultural losses this time were severe but not catastrophic. When spring finally pushed winter aside, it felt less like a natural transition and more like a negotiated surrender. People emerged cautiously, half expecting winter to return and demand rent. For climate scientists today, the winter of 1879-80 illustrates how long-term cold affects everything from energy consumption to food systems to public health. For people who lived through it, the lesson was simpler. Winter doesn't need theatrics to be dangerous. It just needs stamina. And if you were a European living in those months, the joke practically wrote itself. Spring was postponed indefinitely. Victorian Britain prided itself on progress. Railways stitched the nation together, telegraphs conquered distance, and newspapers promised that modern life could outpace nearly any challenge. Then March 9th to 13th, 1891 arrived and proved, quite decisively, that weather still held the winning hand. The Great Blizzard of 1891 struck with such ferocity that even the most confident Victorians had to admit nature could still shut the country down whenever it pleased. The storm barreled into the West Country first, hammering Cornwall, Devon, Dorset, and parts of Wales with winds strong enough to topple trees, tear the roofs from houses and shred telegraph lines like strings of wet cotton. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. Drifts grew taller by the hour, eventually reaching shocking heights, some up to 15 feet, swallowing roads, walls, and even entire cottages. Travellers disappeared into the whiteness. Footpaths ceased to exist. Horses refused to move through the drifts, and even the strongest carts couldn't push through the narrowing tunnels carved by desperate villagers. Though Britain had endured harsh winters before, nothing prepared its people for the combination of snow, wind, and devastating maritime casualties that defined this blizzard. Winds along the southwest coast reached hurricane force. Ships were driven onto rocks, dashed against harbour walls, or simply vanished. In total, approximately 200 people died, some in their homes, many on the roads, and a heartbreaking number at sea. More than 6,000 animals perished as well. Horses, sheep, and cattle caught in the storm, buried alive or frozen where they stood. Railway companies were among the first to realise how outmatched they were. Snowdrifts blocked tracks so thoroughly that trains became stranded in the countryside for days. One famous incident involved the North Cornwall Railway, where an entire train was swallowed by snow so deep that passengers reportedly tried to dig themselves out using tea trays and walking sticks. Meanwhile, railway workers fought to clear lines using shovels, ploughs, and sheer Victorian optimism. None of it worked. Snow fell faster than they could remove it, and wind instantly blew the cleared drifts back into place. Telegraph lines suffered similar defeat. Poles snapped under the weight of ice. Wires disappeared into snowbanks. Communication across large parts of Western Britain collapsed. Towns sent messengers on foot, an absurd necessity in a nation that had spent decades celebrating instant telegrams as the pinnacle of modern efficiency. Britain's cutting-edge technology lasted about 3 minutes against the blizzard's full force. On the coasts, conditions were even worse. The gale drove more than a dozen ships aground within a single night. Lifeboat crews attempted rescues, braving waves that rose like walls and winds that tore oars from their hands. In the town of Lynmouth, a lifeboat was hauled for miles overland, over hills, hedges, and frozen ground. Because the sea was too wild to launch from the harbour, they succeeded in saving lives, but the level of effort required became a symbol of the storm's ferocity. Across rural regions, families huddled inside, listening to the storm batter their walls. Many cottages had fires that barely survived the constant influx of wind. Chimneys belched smoke back into rooms when gusts forced downdrafts through the flues. Villagers dug tunnels through snow to reach barns or outhouses. Farmers spent entire nights rescuing livestock trapped beneath collapsing drifts. Some animals suffocated before help arrived. Others died from the cold even after being freed. In towns, people opened their doors in the morning to find walls of snow blocking their entryways. Bakers couldn't fire their ovens. Milk carts never arrived. Schools closed. Churches closed. Entire communities sat in enforced isolation for days, living off whatever food they had stored. Even the post, proud symbol of Victorian reliability, halted. Letters piled up. Deliveries ceased. The country felt for a moment like it had slipped backward in time, and yet the human response to disaster contained moments of ingenuity and stubborn determination. Neighbours dug each other out. Farmers shared grain, firewood, and shelter with families whose supplies had run out. Railway workers formed chains to haul stranded passengers to safety. Villagers led horses through snow tunnels to rescue people stuck on the roads. Rescue parties fought through drifts taller than men, using poles to probe for buried travellers. When the storm finally ended on March 13th, Britain emerged into a world that looked unfamiliar, white, silent, and devastated. As the snow melted, the full extent of the destruction became painfully clear. Telegraph crews worked day and night to reconnect towns. Railway companies calculated repair costs that soared into the tens of thousands of pounds. Farmers counted animals lost, many realizing they had no hope of financial recovery. Entire coastal communities mourned sailors who never returned. Newspapers quickly transformed the blizzard into public debate. Some demanded better emergency planning. Others criticized shipping companies for allowing vessels to sail despite warnings. Many pointed out, correctly, that wealthier districts had weathered the storm more easily, while poorer rural regions faced devastation with little government support. The blizzard exposed the fragility of Victorian infrastructure, showing just how easily a natural disaster could overpower a nation that believed itself increasingly invincible. For scientists, the 1891 blizzard became a case study in extreme maritime storms, atmospheric instability, and the deadly consequences of rapid pressure drops. For ordinary Victorians, it became a reminder that no amount of progress could fully tame nature. And for the British sense of humour, it became a story with a clear punchline. Victorian Britain discovered weather could win, if winter were a house guest. The winter of 1894 to 1895 was the kind who arrived early, refused to remove its boots, ate all the bread, and then declined to leave even after you pointedly mentioned the time. Stretching from December 27th, 1894 to March 6th, 1895, Britain endured 70 consecutive days of frost, an unbroken freeze so relentless that it appears in Simons's meteorological magazine as one of the most remarkable cold spells of the 19th century. For 70 days the country lived inside a freezer. The frost didn't spike or fluctuate dramatically. Instead, it settled into a steady, bone-deep presence, reshaping daily life through accumulation rather than shock. Unlike blizzards or singular catastrophic events, the winter of 1894 to 95 drained communities with quiet persistence. Each day added a little more strain, a little more difficulty, a little more fear that the cold wasn't merely visiting, it was moving in permanently. The freeze landed at a moment when Britain prided itself on industrial sophistication, but winter cared very little for steam power or national confidence. Temperatures fell on December 27th, and then simply refused to rise again. Days that should have thawed remained stubbornly below freezing. Nights grew colder still, turning ponds, canals, and even sections of rivers into glittering sheets of immovable ice. Across the countryside, farmers watched anxiously as frost penetrated deeper into soil. By early January, the ground was frozen so hard that ploughing became impossible. Winter wheat struggled. Vegetables left in fields for late harvest froze solid, cracking like glass when touched. The agricultural cycle faltered, setting off rumblings of concern in rural markets. If spring arrived late, or if the frost continued, there would be serious consequences. Urban life was no better. Cities entered a strange and uncomfortable rhythm. Each morning, residents awoke to icy windows and frozen pipes. Households kept fires burning constantly, racing to stay ahead of the cold. Fuel use skyrocketed, and so did fuel prices. The poor, who had hoped for a mild season, found themselves scraping together coins for coal that cost more every week. Charitable organisations expanded their winter efforts, distributing blankets, soup and firewood to families who were beginning to buckle under the weight of the extended freeze. Transportation suffered too. Horse-drawn carts struggled on icy cobblestones, their horses slipping with every step. Accidents grew common. Trains experienced delays as icy rails forced slower speeds. Canals, which had been reliable transport routes for goods, froze thick enough to halt shipping entirely. Barges sat imprisoned under inches of hard ice, their crews waiting helplessly for weather warm enough to free them. But the miracle and misery of the 70-day frost was that even as Britain slowed, recreation flourished. The freeze was long enough to create an era of accidental winter tourism. Frozen ponds became skating grounds. Rivers turned into makeshift playgrounds. Newspaper sketches show well-dressed Victorians gliding across ice, surrounded by cheering crowds. In London, the Serpentine hosted thousands of skaters, some talented, many ambitious, and a few who discovered, loudly, that frozen water is not especially forgiving. Across the country, entire communities embraced the novelty of ice thick enough to support crowds. Fishing villages that normally feared winter storms found themselves hosting skating races. Country estates opened their frozen lakes to the public. The long, stable freeze allowed Britain to indulge in the kind of winter activities usually reserved for continental Europe. It was festive, right up until someone fell through thin ice at the edges, an increasingly common hazard as the freeze stretched on and the ice became layered with snow. Yet beneath the winter cheer, the prolonged frost created deeper problems. Poor ventilation from constantly burning fires increased respiratory illnesses. Doctors noted an uptick in cases of bronchitis and pneumonia, conditions already worsened by winter smoke and dampness. Families who relied on day labour found themselves unemployed if the freeze halted outdoor work. Street vendors saw business decline as people avoided standing still in the cold for more than a few minutes. The frost was beautiful, but it was oppressive. Some regions experienced what historians now call ice famine, a paradoxical shortage of accessible fresh water because wells and pumps froze. Households melted snow for drinking water, discovering quickly that snow, despite its appearance, yields surprisingly little liquid when melted. Laundry routines collapsed, hygiene suffered, cooking became difficult when water had to be coaxed from snowdrifts. Despite the national struggle, the frost kept going. January passed, February arrived, temperatures dipped again. People began muttering that winter had forgotten to check its calendar. Many newspapers published jokes about the season applying for permanent residency. Even Simon's meteorological magazine remarked on the bizarre endurance of the cold, noting that such a consistent freeze had few precedents. When March 6th, 1895 finally broke the streak, it was not with a triumphant thaw, but with a faint, almost apologetic rise in temperature, a slight warming that allowed frost to lift in a few scattered regions. It wasn't spring yet, not truly, but it was a start, and after 70 days of ice, a start was enough. The long frost left behind a mixed legacy. For some, it was remembered as the most picturesque winter of their lives, filled with skating parties and dazzling landscapes. For others, particularly the poor, it was a season of deprivation, cold rooms, empty coal scuttles, and endless scraping for survival. Lead climate scientists later used the event as a benchmark for studying the effects of prolonged freezes on European weather patterns, agricultural resilience, and human adaptability. To those who lived through it, the lesson was simple. Winter is not dangerous only when it is fierce. It is also dangerous when it refuses to end. Or, as one Victorian humorist might have put it, winter forgot when to leave. Winter in 19th century Europe was always a test of endurance, but for the poor, it came with an additional obstacle, one that couldn't be shoveled, burned, or prayed away. It was the obstacle with the sharpest teeth and the slowest movements: bureaucracy. If cold tried to kill you quickly, bureaucracy tried to kill you slowly. Survival often depended not on warmth or fuel, but on forms, signatures, eligibility requirements, and the ability to navigate systems that treated desperation as something that needed verification before assistance could be considered. Across Britain and much of Europe, winter relief operated through overlapping networks of parishes, municipal boards, charitable societies, and poor law unions. On paper, these organisations existed to distribute resources, coal, bread, money, or shelter, to those who needed them. In practice, they often distributed paperwork, suspicion, and waiting times long enough to freeze your optimism solid. Eligibility rules governed everything. A widow with children needed to prove widowhood. A labourer needed to demonstrate unemployment wasn't due to idleness. A sick man needed documentation signed by a doctor who might live 5 miles away. 5 miles you had to walk because winter made roads impassable, and you couldn't afford a horse. Even something as simple as receiving a loaf of relief bread could require a referral slip, a stamped form, and the approval of a clerk who was convinced at least half the applicants were lying. Winter exposed the cracks in these systems with brutal clarity. Needs increased sharply: fuel shortages, frozen wages, illness, crop failures, and transport shutdowns all meant more people turning to relief. But bureaucratic capacity did not increase with it. Offices remained understaffed. Clerks were overworked. Records overflowed. Waiting rooms filled with shivering families whose breath frosted on their own paperwork. Delays were not just inconvenient, they were lethal. When temperatures were well below freezing, a delay of a week could determine whether a family burned fuel, burned furniture, or simply sat in the cold until sickness arrived. A delay of a month could mean eviction, starvation, or death. Charitable organisations tried to fill the gaps, but even charities sometimes required documentation. A family had to prove they weren't receiving support elsewhere. They had to demonstrate moral worthiness, sobriety, good character, church attendance. Winter demanded obedience, not just from the weather, but from human behaviour. Relief wasn't a right, it was a conditional privilege. In cities, the poor stood in long lines outside distribution centres, lines so long they wound through streets and alleys. People stamped their feet to stay warm. Babies cried inside blankets. Elderly applicants leaned on walking sticks that trembled with both cold and frustration. Sometimes the line froze before the people did. Relief offices closed for the day while dozens remained outside waiting for their turn. Rural areas faced a different nightmare. Travelling to the relief office could mean walking several miles through snowdrifts or across icy ground. If you didn't arrive before closing, and closing hours were early, you had to return another day, burning calories you couldn't spare. Some parishes required applicants to visit in person multiple times to verify need. Winter transformed these trips into trials of endurance, in measuring a person's worthiness by their ability to survive the process. It wasn't just Britain. Across continental Europe, municipalities had their own paperwork-heavy relief systems. Austria-Hungary required residence permits to receive local assistance. Losing your documentation meant losing eligibility. France relied on commune-level oversight, where applications moved up chains of officials who each needed to sign off. German cities operated with alarming efficiency in sending applicants away if forms were incomplete, wrongly filed, or missing proof of residency. For people already weakened by hunger, illness, or cold, these systems became nearly impossible to navigate. A widow with frostbitten fingers struggled to write her name. A labourer sick with bronchitis couldn't stand in line for hours. A mother carrying 2 children couldn't walk 5 miles through a snowstorm because the parish board wanted clarification on her household situation. And yet, relief officials often interpreted difficulty navigating the system as proof of irresponsibility rather than desperation. Bureaucracy insisted on order in a season defined by chaos. It demanded paperwork from people whose homes had no heat. It required repeated visits from families who could barely walk. It expected compliance from those who were fighting for their lives. And winter, unhelpful as always, magnified every inefficiency. When relief finally arrived, coal tickets, bread vouchers, small cash payments, it often came too late to prevent suffering. Clerks logged each transaction with careful handwriting, and sometimes noting the tragic details that accompanied them. Applicant's child deceased, husband lost to illness, family without fuel for several days. These notes read like quiet indictments of the system itself. Even the physical environment of bureaucracy seemed designed for discomfort. Drafty parish halls with stone floors, cold offices where windows didn't seal properly, relief counters positioned so applicants had to stand rather than sit. Meanwhile, behind the desk, clerks worked beside fireplaces while applicants shivered on the other side of the room. Yet for all its flaws, bureaucracy was still one of the only mechanisms available. Without it, relief distribution might have been arbitrary or corrupt. With it, survival came wrapped in administrative frostbite. Winter didn't just threaten bodies, it exposed institutions. And systems designed for normal times buckled under seasonal strain. Rules meant to maintain order impeded urgent care. Procedures created to ensure fairness instead created barriers, and so the humour of this chapter lands with grim accuracy. In a season when cold moved fast, the bureaucracy moved slower. People did not freeze because they failed to seek help. They froze because help required navigating paperwork that did not acknowledge winter at all. Or, as the poor of the 19th century might have said while shivering in line, you didn't freeze faster, you froze in line. Winter in 19th century Europe didn't just alter the landscape, it altered the people living in it. It reshaped expectations, rewired habits, and rewrote the rules of daily life. For months at a time, each of the season forced millions into a kind of psychological crouch, one where comfort felt like a rumour, hardship felt routine, and the mental boundaries of normal shifted dramatically. Winter was not simply endured, it was internalized, transforming how people thought, acted, planned, spoke, and even dreamed. One of the most striking social shifts was the normalization of discomfort. Cold homes weren't a failure. Freezing mornings weren't an inconvenience. They were simply how life worked between November and March. People woke expecting to see their breath across the bedroom, to break ice in their water basins, to feel numb fingers before the fire was coaxed back to life. A warm room was not a baseline. It was an achievement. The season trained people to treat basic comfort with suspicion, as if warmth itself were an indulgence that couldn't be trusted to last. Daily behaviour adjusted accordingly. Every action was measured through the lens of energy conservation. Movements slowed. Tasks were consolidated. Trips outdoors were evaluated with military precision. Do you really need to? Will you survive the return journey without crying? Can the errand wait until a day when the wind isn't actively mocking you? People became winter strategists. They planned routes that minimized exposure. They gathered in the warmest rooms like migrating animals. They ate meals quickly so they wouldn't lose heat. They developed an instinctive talent for identifying the exact position in a room least vulnerable to drafts. A surprising amount of social interaction revolved around sharing these tiny survival techniques. Yeah, winter created a kind of communal knowledge base. Where to stand, what to wear, how to sit, how to breathe, when to move, when not to move. The cold turned everyone into amateur physicists of their own suffering. But winter's influence extended beyond logistics. It reshaped emotions and attitudes. People became more cautious, more serious, more restrained. Humour darkened, patience thinned, tempers shortened. A dropped bucket, a blown-out candle, or a mislaid glove could trigger disproportionate frustration, not because anyone was unreasonable, but because winter lowered everyone's resilience by draining them slowly, hour by hour. The cold didn't shout, it nagged. Communities responded by reinforcing social discipline. Disorder was dangerous when resources were scarce, harmony mattered. Winter created an unspoken expectation. Everyone must behave because the margin for error shrank dramatically. Gossip softened. Public drunkenness became more frowned upon. Petty disputes were set aside or postponed until warmer months. One historical observer joked that quarrels thaw in spring. Winter demanded unity, or at least quiet coexistence. Even speech patterns shifted. People spoke less, to conserve breath and warmth. They used shorter phrases. They murmured rather than projected. Quiet households weren't always peaceful. They were cold, conserving energy like hibernating creatures. Nights grew longer, but conversation grew shorter. In wealthier homes, winter encouraged introspection, reading, writing, mending, and indoor hobbies. In poorer homes, it encouraged silence and physical closeness. Families sat together not because they sought intimacy, but because spreading out across a room was simply inefficient. Winter rearranged the geography of households. Everyone gravitated toward the warmest square yard of space. Dreams changed too. People recorded thoughts of warmth with surprising obsession, memories of summer fields, fantasies of spring crops, recollections of warmer countries they had never actually visited. Winter turned the mind creative through deprivation. Imagination became a heating system when firewood ran low. Winter also sharpened social hierarchies. The wealthy might complain about boredom or chilly study rooms. The poor feared death. That awareness shaped behaviour. The well-off performed generosity more visibly. Philanthropic gestures increased, not only from compassion, but because winter made suffering impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, poor families behaved with almost ritualistic frugality, saving crumbs, repairing clothing obsessively, extinguishing candles early, rationing conversations about food to avoid distressing children. One lesser discussed behavioural shift was the seasonal quieting of ambition. Winter shut down plans. People placed dreams, goals and projects into a kind of mental hibernation. Big decisions were delayed, journeys postponed, marriage negotiations slowed, apprenticeships paused. Winter wasn't just cold, it was culturally inert. It told people, survive now, resume living later. Psychologically, this created an odd duality. People accepted difficulty with stoic resignation, yet remained remarkably hopeful about the return of spring. Winter taught both practicality and endurance. Daily suffering coexisted with long-term optimism. It was perhaps the most emotionally complex season, oppressive yet predictable, demoralizing yet temporary. And above all, winter demanded adaptability. People became experts in the art of making do. They extended the life of candles by trimming wicks carefully. They kept warm by hanging curtains over doors. They patched garments again and again until the original fabric barely existed. They told reassuring stories to keep children from panicking during storms. Winter taught improvisation long before it became a modern virtue. In the end, winter's behavioural impact was not merely physical survival. It was psychological reshaping. The season forced communities to redefine normal, to accept hardship as a seasonal personality trait, and to adjust their expectations of comfort, time, and emotional expression. Winter didn't care about human routines, so humans changed their routines to accommodate winter. And once you alter your expectations deeply enough, something funny happens. Comfort starts to feel not just rare, but almost suspicious, like a trap or a test. Or, phrased in the humour of the era, comfort became suspicious. Winter in 1800s, Europe was not just a season. It was a shaping force, a sculptor of societies, institutions and expectations. To survive, it wasn't only to endure the cold, it was to navigate the systems, habits and compromises that emerged because of the cold. By the end of the century, winter had quietly done what governments struggled to do openly. It had reshaped Europe through pressure, necessity, and repetition. The good news? People survived. The bad news? They survived by learning to lower their expectations until warmth felt like a rumour, and comfort like a privilege reserved for mythological beings. One of the most lasting consequences of winter survival was the development of early welfare infrastructures. So many families fell into crisis between November and March that relief systems were forced to evolve, not out of benevolence, but out of accumulation. Every winter resurrected the same problems: hunger, fuel poverty, illness, unemployment, and transport paralysis. Governments, parish boards, and municipal leaders began building responses not to solve winter, but to manage the damage it caused. The poor law system hardened into a year-round bureaucratic machine largely because winter made human vulnerability impossible to ignore. Houses filled with smoke and frost. Work collapsed with the weather. Children fell ill at higher rates. Relief offices saw surges so predictable they could build their budgets around them. Over time, the sheer regularity of seasonal suffering forced institutions to standardize responses. Winter did not inspire compassion. It inspired administration. Housing also began to change. Throughout the 19th century, reformers, inspectors, and public health advocates continually pointed to the same winter realities. Overcrowded rooms with drafty walls led to sickness. Poor quality roofs collapsed under snow. Uninsulated stone walls trapped dampness that caused respiratory problems. Though improvements were slow and uneven, the push for better urban housing stock was deeply tied to winter mortality rates, and Europe did not wake up one day and decide to build warmer homes. It was dragged toward that conclusion by decades of cold seasons that made bad construction lethal. Fuel policies grew out of the same pressure. Fuel poverty, once considered a moral failing, became recognised as a structural issue. Cities experimented with coal distribution programs, price controls, and municipal fuel depots. Rural communities organised collective wood-gathering networks. Charities distributed coal tickets every winter because the alternative was seeing families freeze in the dark. The cold, more than politics, forced Europe to acknowledge that warmth wasn't simply a commodity. It was a necessity, unevenly accessible and socially meaningful. Labour expectations also shifted. Winter made clear that employment for the working poor was unstable, seasonal, and vulnerable to forces far beyond individual control. Factories shut down when rivers froze. Construction halted when frost hardened the ground. Agricultural workers starved when harvests failed. Winter's disruption created the early groundwork for discussions about unemployment relief, workers' protections, and the need for a social safety net. It wasn't ideology that sparked these conversations. It was weather. On a cultural level, winter shaped how Europeans viewed endurance. Generation after generation internalized the idea that life between December and March was supposed to be lean, austere, and challenging. Hardship was not a surprise. It was a season. People didn't simply prepare for winter, they braced for it. They told stories of past freezes, past shortages, past storms. Winter became both a shared memory and a shared identity. It left emotional marks as surely as it left physical ones. This normalization of struggle influenced behavior long after temperatures warmed. Conservatism in spending, meticulous saving of food, frugality in fuel usage, and caution in planning all stemmed from the knowledge that winter would return and demand sacrifices. Survival wasn't built on optimism. It was built on anticipation of difficulty. And yet, for all its brutality, winter forged systems of mutual aid as well. Neighbours helped neighbours because isolation in cold months was dangerous. Villages supported widows and the elderly because winter did not tolerate weakness. Cities developed networks of volunteers, soup kitchens, and religious societies that formed the beginnings of modern social work. Winter didn't just test communities, it forced them to function. By the late 19th century, industrialization and urbanization brought new challenges, but winter remained Europe's uninvited consultant, reshaping everything from heating technologies to transportation design. Frost-resistant pipes, improved chimneys, enclosed stoves, coal-burning efficiency standards, even rail timetables were modified in acknowledgement that winter ran its own schedule, indifferent to human ambition. And as the century turned, Europe slowly transitioned into a world where warmth became less precarious. Homes improved, fuel became more accessible, medicine advanced, relief systems matured. The cold did not disappear, but its dominion weakened. Modern comfort, central heating, insulated walls, steady food supplies, reliable transport was built on a foundation created by centuries of winter-driven resilience. Winter forced Europe to innovate. It forced Europe to organize. It forced Europe to plan. In a very real sense, the modern world exists because the old one spent so long shivering. So the good news? You survived winter in 1800s Europe. The bad news? You did it by never expecting warmth. Because survival then didn't mean beating the cold. It meant mastering the art of lowering your expectations until the cold stopped noticing you at all.